What happens when a homeless man's single act of kindness catches the attention of a billionaire CEO? This is the story of Daniel Hayes, a man who lost everything but still chose to give his last jacket to a shivering stranger. That stranger turned out to be Vivian Langston, one of the most powerful women in America. What she discovered in that jacket pocket would change both their lives forever. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and don't forget to comment which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The bitter December wind cut through Manhattan's financial district, like a blade carrying with it the promise of the year's first real snowstorm. Steam rose from manholes in ghostly spirals, and the few pedestrians still braving the streets at 11:47 p.m. moved with the urgent shuffle of people desperate to escape the cold. Neon signs from all-night diners and convenience stores painted the wet asphalt in streaks of red and blue, creating an urban canvas that spoke of loneliness and survival. Daniel Hayes pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked, each step a careful calculation of energy conservation. At 42, he looked older, the kind of premature aging that comes from sleeping in a truck for 8 months, from choosing between gas and food, from carrying the weight of dreams that had crumbled to dust. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, caught the glow of street lamps as he made his way toward the 24-hour laundromat, where he'd been doing odd jobs for the owner, in exchange for a few dollars and the chance to wash his clothes. The truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, sat parked 3 blocks away in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant. It wasn't much, but it was home. The back was fitted with a thin mattress, a sleeping bag that had lost most of its warmth, and a milk crate that served as both table and storage. Taped to the passenger side window was a photograph that Daniel looked at every morning and every night, a 7-year-old boy with gap-toothed grin and eyes that sparkled with the kind of joy that only children possess. Noah. His son's name was a prayer, a wound, and a promise, all wrapped into 3 syllables that Daniel whispered into the darkness of countless sleepless nights. It had been 14 months since the custody hearing, 14 months since Judge Morrison had looked down at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment and declared him financially and emotionally unfit to care for his own child. "Mr. Hayes," the judge had said, his voice echoing in the sterile courtroom, "I understand you've suffered tremendous loss with your wife's passing, but Noah needs stability. He needs a home, consistent meals, and educational opportunities that you simply cannot provide in your current state." Current state. As if grief and financial ruin were temporary inconveniences that could be overcome with positive thinking and determination. As if losing Sarah to cancer hadn't cost him everything, the medical bills that ate through their savings, the time off work that led to his termination, the spiral into depression that cost him their apartment, their car, and eventually his son. The bus stop on 47th and Lexington stood like a lonely sentinel under a flickering streetlight. Daniel had passed it countless times on his nightly walks that served the dual purpose of staying warm and avoiding the attention of cops who might move him along from whatever doorway or alley he'd chosen for the night. Tonight, however, the stop wasn't empty. A woman sat huddled on the metal bench, her body language screaming discomfort and cold. Even from a distance, Daniel could see her shivering. Not the gentle tremor of someone caught off guard by the weather, but the violent, uncontrollable shaking of someone whose body was losing the battle against the elements. She was dressed expensively, a black wool coat that probably cost more than Daniel had seen in months, designer heels that were completely inappropriate for December in New York, and a dress that suggested she'd been somewhere important before ending up stranded at this desolate bus stop. Daniel's first instinct was to keep walking. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved, especially with people who clearly existed in a different economic stratosphere, rarely ended well for someone in his position. Rich people had their own problems, their own solutions, their own networks of support. They didn't need help from someone who couldn't even help himself. But as he drew closer, something made him pause. Maybe it was the way she held herself proud, despite her obvious distress, dignified even while shivering violently. Maybe it was the reminder of Sarah, who had always chided him for his tendency to overthink acts of kindness. "Sometimes, Danny," she used to say, "you just do the right thing because it's right, not because it makes sense." The woman looked up as his footsteps approached, and Daniel saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful in the way that spoke of good genetics and expensive maintenance, probably in her late 30s, with dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. But there was something else there too, a weariness that matched his own, a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "Excuse me," Daniel heard himself saying, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Are you okay?" She studied him for a moment, and he could see her making the same calculations he'd made moments before, assessing threat level, determining whether this interaction was worth the risk. Her gaze took in his worn clothes, his unkempt appearance, the way he kept his hands visible, and his posture non-threatening. "My car broke down," she said, finally, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I called for a ride, but apparently there's some kind of surge pricing situation, and the wait time is—" She glanced at her phone. 47 minutes. Daniel nodded, understanding immediately. Surge pricing during bad weather could make a ride cost more than some people made in a day. Of course, looking at her clothes and accessories, money probably wasn't the issue, availability was. "The buses don't run this route after midnight," he offered. "Won't be another one until 5 a.m. I gathered that. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself, and Daniel could see goosebumps on her exposed neck, where her coat didn't quite meet her hairline. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the first fat snowflakes of the promised storm. The woman's shivering intensified, and Daniel made a decision that would later seem both inevitable and impossible. "Here," he said, already shrugging out of his jacket. "Take this." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "What? You're freezing." He held out the jacket, a brown canvas work coat that had seen better years but was still warm, still functional. "Take it." "I can't," she began, but Daniel was already stepping forward, draping the coat around her shoulders. "You can give it back when your ride comes," he said, though they both knew that was unlikely. "Or don't. I've got others." This was a lie, and they both probably knew it, but it was the kind of lie that preserved dignity on both sides. The jacket engulfed her smaller frame, and Daniel felt a pang of something that might have been pride, watching her immediately stop shivering as the residual warmth from his body heat transferred to hers. She pulled it tighter around herself, and for a moment they stood in silence under the flickering streetlight, while snow began to dust the ground around them. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice softer now, less guarded. Daniel shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "My wife used to say that kindness doesn't cost anything, but it's worth everything. Used to. She died. Cancer." The words came out matter-of-factly, the way they always did now. He'd learned that emotional distance was the only way to say them without breaking down entirely. The woman's expression shifted, and Daniel saw something like recognition flash across her features. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." He stuffed his hands into his pockets, already feeling the cold seeping through his thin sweater. Look, your ride should be here soon. I should... Wait. She stood up, and even with his jacket dwarfing her, she managed to project an aura of authority that made Daniel pause. What's your name? Daniel. Daniel Hayes. She extended a hand, and he noticed her manicure was perfect, her skin soft in a way that spoke of moisturizers and regular spa treatments. Vivian. Her handshake was firm businesslike, and Daniel found himself wondering what she did for a living that required her to be out this late in this part of the city. Finance, probably. Law, maybe. Something that paid well enough for designer clothes and late-night emergencies that required expensive car services. Thank you, Daniel, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name that made him think she was memorizing it. This means more than you know. Before he could respond, headlights swept across the bus stop as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down his window and called out, "Vivian Langston!" "That's me." She looked back at Daniel, and for a moment he thought she might say something else. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you again." She walked toward the car, his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, and Daniel watched as the driver got out to open her door. Professional courtesy. Definitely someone important then. Just before she got into the car, she turned back one last time. "Daniel," she called out, "your wife was right about kindness." And then she was gone, leaving Daniel standing alone in the falling snow, already shivering in his thin sweater, wondering why he'd just given his only warm jacket to a stranger who could probably buy a dozen jackets without thinking twice about the cost. The walk back to his truck took longer than usual. Without the jacket, the cold seemed to find every gap in his defenses, seeping through his sweater and settling into his bones with a persistence that made his teeth chatter. By the time he reached the alley behind the Chinese restaurant, his hands were so numb he could barely work the truck's door handle. Inside the cab, Daniel started the engine and turned the heat up as high as it would go, which wasn't very high given the truck's age and condition. He pulled the sleeping bag around his shoulders and leaned back against the seat, trying to warm up enough to think clearly. What had he just done? He'd given away his only jacket, his only real protection against the winter that was promising to be brutal to a woman who was clearly wealthy enough to replace it without a second thought. It was exactly the kind of impulsive decision that had contributed to his current situation, the kind of thinking that his ex-mother-in-law had called financially irresponsible during the custody hearing. "Your Honor," she had testified, her voice dripping with disappointment, "Daniel has always been prone to poor decision-making. Even when Sarah was sick, he was giving money to homeless shelters and food banks instead of saving for medical expenses. He simply doesn't understand priorities." At the time, Daniel had wanted to explain that Sarah had insisted on continuing their charitable giving even during her illness, that she'd said it helped her feel like they were still contributing something positive to the world, even while their own world was falling apart. But his lawyer had advised him to stay quiet, and he'd watched in silence as his character was systematically dismantled by people who had never had to choose between heating and eating. Now sitting in his freezing truck, Daniel wondered if maybe they'd been right. Maybe he was too impulsive, too willing to sacrifice his own well-being for others. Maybe that's why he was living in a truck while his son lived with his maternal grandparents in their comfortable suburban home, getting the stability and security that Daniel couldn't provide. He pulled out his phone, a cheap prepaid model that he kept on the most basic plan possible, and stared at the contact labeled Noah's school. Tomorrow was the Christmas pageant. Noah was playing a shepherd, and he'd been practicing his one line for weeks. Daniel had been planning to sneak into the back of the auditorium just to see his son on stage, to be there for one moment of Noah's childhood that he hadn't already missed. But showing up to his son's school looking homeless, smelling like the truck he lived in, Drawing attention from other parents and teachers, was that really in Noah's best interest? Or was it just another example of Daniel's poor decision-making, putting his own needs ahead of what was actually good for his child? The phone rang, startling him out of his spiral of self-doubt. The number was blocked, and Daniel's first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. Blocked calls were usually bill collectors or scammers, neither of which he had the energy to deal with at nearly 1 a.m. But something made him answer. "Hello, Daniel Hayes." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Yeah, that's me. Who's this?" "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm calling on behalf of a client who would like to meet with you tomorrow morning." Daniel frowned. "I think you've got the wrong number. I'm not meeting with anybody about anything." "The woman you helped tonight, at the bus stop on 47th and Lexington." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "How did you—" "My client would like to return your jacket and express her gratitude properly. Would you be available to meet at 9 a.m.? Daniel's mind raced. How had she found his number? How did she even know his last name? He'd given her his first name only, and there were thousands of Daniels in New York City. "Look, I don't know what this is about," he said carefully. "But I don't need any gratitude. I did what anyone would do." "Perhaps. But my client feels differently. The meeting would be brief, and there would be compensation for your time." Compensation. The word hung in the air like a lifeline Daniel wasn't sure he should grab. He'd learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that his bank account had $47 in it, and his truck was due for an inspection he couldn't afford. "What kind of compensation?" he asked, hating himself for asking, but unable to stop. "We can discuss that tomorrow. Would the Regency Hotel lobby work for you 9 a.m.? The Regency Hotel. Daniel had walked past it countless times, one of those places where doormen wore white gloves and the marble in the lobby probably cost more than most people's cars. Not exactly his usual environment. "I don't know," he said. "This all seems pretty weird." "I understand your hesitation, but I assure you this is completely legitimate. My client simply wants to thank you properly for your kindness." Daniel closed his eyes, weighing his options. On one hand, this could be some kind of scam, though he couldn't figure out what anyone would want to scam him out of. On the other hand, if it was legitimate, and if there really was compensation involved, it might mean the difference between eating tomorrow and going hungry. "Okay," he said finally. 9 a.m. at the Regency. "Excellent. Ask for the Langston party. They'll direct you." The line went dead, leaving Daniel staring at his phone in confusion. Langston. The driver had called her Vivian Langston. He'd assumed it was her first name and whatever her married name was. But what if Langston was her last name? What if she wasn't just wealthy, but wealthy? Daniel spent the next hour trying to get warm enough to sleep. But his mind kept circling back to the phone call, to the woman at the bus stop, to the way she'd looked at him when he'd given her the jacket. There had been something in her expression. Surprise, yes, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. Finally, exhaustion won out over curiosity and cold, and Daniel dozed fitfully until the sun began to filter through the truck's windows. He'd learned to wake up early before the restaurant workers arrived, and before anyone else might take notice of the truck that had been parked in their alley for longer than was probably welcome. The morning routine was efficient, born of necessity: baby wipes for a rudimentary wash deodorant to mask what the baby wipes couldn't fix, and a careful selection of his least wrinkled clothes. He had exactly one outfit that could pass for respectable khakis, and a button-down shirt that he'd rescued from his old life back when he had an office job, and a reason to dress professionally. The Regency Hotel was a 15-minute walk from the alley, But Daniel took his time, stopping at a corner deli to spend 3 of his precious dollars on coffee and using the bathroom to check his appearance one more time. In the fluorescent light of the deli's restroom, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who was trying his best to appear put together, despite circumstances that made that nearly impossible. The hotel lobby was everything Daniel had expected and worse. Marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than he'd made in his last year of employment, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that spoke of serious money and serious power. He approached the concierge desk feeling like an imposter, waiting for someone to demand his credentials or ask him to leave. "I'm here to see the Langston party," he said to the impeccably dressed woman behind the desk. She consulted her computer with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she dealt with unusual requests regularly. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. Ms. Langston is waiting for you in the Madison suite, 32nd floor." She handed him a key card. "The elevator is to your right." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave Daniel time to question every decision that had led him to this moment. He was about to meet with someone who apparently had enough influence to track down his personal information and enough money to book hotel suites on what seemed like a whim. Someone who could probably destroy what was left of his life with a phone call if he said or did the wrong thing. The Madison suite door opened before Daniel could knock, revealing a man in an expensive suit who had to be Marcus Webb. He was younger than Daniel had expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to handling delicate situations for powerful people. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming." He stepped aside to let Daniel enter. "Ms. Langston is waiting for you." The suite was larger than any apartment Daniel had ever lived in, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Central Park and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. And sitting in a chair by the windows, wearing a charcoal gray business suit that probably cost more than Daniel's truck was worth, was the woman from the bus stop. In daylight, in her natural environment, she was even more imposing than she'd been the night before. Her hair was styled in a way that suggested professional attention. Her makeup was flawless, and she radiated the kind of authority that made it clear she was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. But she was still wearing his jacket. "Daniel," she said, standing as he entered. "Thank you for coming." "Vivian." He nodded, unsure of the protocol for this situation. "You didn't have to go through all this just to return a jacket." She smiled, and there was something almost sad about it. "Actually, I did. Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee? Breakfast?" Daniel wanted to say no to maintain whatever dignity he had left, but his stomach betrayed him with a low growl that echoed in the quiet suite. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. "Coffee would be great," he said, settling into a chair that was more comfortable than his bed in the truck. Vivian nodded to Marcus, who moved to a side table where a coffee service was already waiting. "I have to admit, Daniel, I did some research after our meeting last night." "Research?" "I wanted to understand who you are. What kind of person gives away their only jacket to a complete stranger?" She accepted a cup of coffee from Marcus and cupped it in her hands, as if seeking warmth despite the suite being perfectly heated. "What I found broke my heart." Daniel tensed. "I don't know what you think you found." "I found that you're a widower who lost everything taking care of his dying wife. I found that you're living in your truck because you chose love over financial security. I found that you have a 7-year-old son who's living with his grandparents because the court decided you were unfit to care for him." Her voice was gentle, but each word hit Daniel like a physical blow. "I found that despite having every reason to be bitter and angry, you still chose to help a stranger who had everything you'd lost." Daniel set down his coffee cup with hands that had started to shake. You had no right to dig into my life. You're absolutely right. I didn't. She leaned forward, her expression intense. But I had to understand what drove you to that choice. Because in my world, people don't do things without expecting something in return. Kindness always comes with a price tag. Not mine. No, not yours. She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could hear the subtle sounds of the city filtering through the windows, car horns, sirens, the constant hum of 8 million people going about their lives. When I got home last night, I found something in your jacket pocket. She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper, a child's drawing in crayon that Daniel recognized immediately. It was a picture Noah had drawn months ago during one of their last supervised visits. A stick-figure man and a smaller stick-figure boy holding hands under a yellow sun with "I love you, Daddy" written in 7-year-old handwriting across the top. Daniel's throat closed up. He'd forgotten the drawing was in there, forgotten that he'd transferred it from his wallet to his jacket pocket during one of those nights when holding on to some physical reminder of his son was the only thing keeping him going. I have a picture like this, Vivian said softly. One I drew for my father when I was about Noah's age. He was never around much, always working, always building his empire. But I loved him anyway, the way children do. She turned the drawing over in her hands. He threw it away. I found it in his office trash can when I went to visit him at work. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss and disappointment and the ways that people fail each other. I'm sorry, Daniel said, and meant it. Are you? Because I'm not. Vivian looked up at him, and there was steel in her expression now. That moment taught me something important about the kind of person I never wanted to become. And last night meeting you, seeing this, she held up the drawing. It reminded me that I might have failed anyway. Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Marcus moved quietly around the suite, refilling coffee cups and somehow managing to be both present and invisible. I want to offer you something, Vivian continued. Not charity, not pity, a job. A job? Daniel repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. I run a company, Langston Industries. We do consulting primarily for corporations that are struggling with employee morale and public image, and she set the drawing down on the table between them. What I've realized is that all the MBA courses and leadership seminars in the world can't teach what you demonstrated last night. Genuine compassion. The ability to put someone else's needs ahead of your own, even when you have nothing to spare. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to hire me to teach compassion? Look at me, Vivian. I'm living in a truck. I can't even get my own son back. What makes you think I'm qualified to help anyone? Because you're still here. Her voice was quiet but firm. Because after everything you've lost, everything you've been through, you still saw a stranger in need and acted without hesitation. Because you know what it means to lose everything and keep going anyway. She stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city below. I've spent the last 15 years building my company, making money, accumulating power, and somewhere along the way, I forgot why any of it mattered. I became exactly like my father, successful, respected, and completely disconnected from anything that actually matters. So change, Daniel said. You don't need me for that. Don't I? She turned back to face him. Last night was the first time in years that someone did something for me without wanting anything in return. The first time I felt human, connected to something real. She paused. I want to learn how to do that. how to see people the way you saw me last night. And I want to help other people learn it too. Daniel stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. You're talking about some kind of consulting position. I'm talking about creating a new division of my company. Corporate empathy training, for lack of a better term. Teaching executives and managers how to connect with their employees as human beings instead of just productivity units. She sat back down, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd found a new purpose. You'd design the programs, lead the workshops, help people remember what it means to care about each other. I don't have any experience with that kind of thing. You have the only experience that matters. You've lived it. Daniel felt something stirring in his chest, hope maybe, or possibility, but it was quickly overwhelmed by doubt and fear. What if I'm not good at it? What if I fail? Then we'll figure something else out. Vivian shrugged, as if failure was just another problem to be solved. But I don't think you will. I think you'll be extraordinary. For a long moment they sat in silence. Daniel could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the magnitude of what was being offered. A job. A real job with someone who seemed to understand what he'd been through, what he was still going through. What about Noah? He asked finally. The custody situation. A steady job with a competitive salary should help with that, Vivian said. And I know some excellent family law attorneys. Not a guarantee, but a much better starting position than you have now. Daniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a different future. An apartment instead of a truck. Regular meals. The possibility of seeing his son more than twice a month under court supervision. The chance to rebuild something that looked like a life. There's one more thing, Vivian said, and something in her tone made Daniel open his eyes. I want you to know that this isn't about guilt or charity or some rich person's attempt to buy her way into heaven. This is business. I think you can help my company, and I think my company can help you. But if you take this job, I'll expect you to earn your salary. I'll expect professionalism and results and the same level of commitment I'd expect from any employee. Good, Daniel said, and meant it. He'd had enough of pity to last a lifetime. When do I start? The smile that spread across Vivian's face was like sunrise, gradual, then brilliant, transforming her entire expression. How about Monday? As Daniel left the Regency Hotel 45 minutes later, he carried with him not just his returned jacket, but a folder full of paperwork, a business card, with Vivian's direct number and the first real hope he'd felt in over a year. The salary they'd discussed was more than he'd made at his last job, enough to afford a decent apartment and maybe even start saving for the legal battle ahead. But more than that, he carried the knowledge that his choice the night before, the impulsive, financially irresponsible decision to give away his only jacket, had somehow led to this moment. Had led to a chance he never could have imagined offered by a woman who understood loss and failure and the long road back from both. As he walked back toward the alley where his truck waited, Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled to Noah's school contact. The Christmas pageant was tonight. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a right to be there, like he had something to offer his son besides just love and good intentions. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to turn around. The afternoon passed in a blur of practical preparations. Daniel used some of his remaining cash to do laundry at a laundromat, showered at a gym where he'd once had a membership, and still had a friend working the front desk, and even managed to get his hair cut at a barber school for $10. By the time evening arrived, he looked more like the man he used to be. Professional, put together, someone who belonged in his son's school auditorium. The Christmas pageant was everything Daniel had hoped for and more. Noah stood on stage in his shepherd costume, clutching his staff with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old who knew all eyes were on him. When his moment came, his one line about following the star, his voice rang out clear and proud, and Daniel felt his heart swell with the kind of fierce paternal love that made everything else fade away. After the performance, as families milled around the auditorium, sharing cookies and punch, Daniel hung back, watching Noah from a distance. He'd learned not to approach directly at these events. It upset Noah to see him, and then have to say goodbye, and it made the grandparents uncomfortable. But just being there, witnessing this moment in his son's life, felt like a victory. "Daddy." Daniel turned to find Noah standing beside him, still wearing his shepherd costume, his face bright with excitement and surprise. "Hey, buddy." Daniel knelt down to Noah's level, drinking in the sight of his son up close. "You were amazing up there. Best shepherd in the whole pageant." Noah beamed. "I didn't forget my line. Grandma said I might forget because I was nervous, but I didn't. I knew you wouldn't. You're too smart to forget something that important." For a moment, they just looked at each other, father and son connected by love that had survived separation and legal battles and all the ways that life could tear families apart. "Mr. Hayes." The voice belonged to Eleanor Morrison, Noah's maternal grandmother, and Daniel could hear the disapproval in her tone even before he turned around. "I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel stood slowly, automatically putting himself between Noah and any potential conflict. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison. The pageant was beautiful. Noah did wonderfully." "Yes, well." Eleanor's gaze took in Daniel's improved appearance with obvious surprise. "I suppose you'll want to say goodbye to Noah now. We really should be getting home." But before Daniel could respond, Noah had wrapped his arms around his father's waist in a fierce hug that said everything words couldn't express. And in that moment, holding his son close and feeling hope bloom in his chest like a flower after winter, Daniel knew that everything was about to change. Everything. The Monday morning that changed everything started before dawn in the truck that had been Daniel's home for 8 months. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling between excitement and terror about what lay ahead. At 5:30 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely and began the careful process of preparing for his first day at Langston Industries. The gym shower felt like a luxury he'd almost forgotten existed. Hot water cascaded over his shoulders as he scrubbed away the lingering scent of truck living and tried to wash off the accumulated grime of homelessness. He'd managed to buy the decent shirt and tie over the weekend, with the advance Vivian had insisted on giving him, and as he looked at himself in the mirror while shaving, he could almost see glimpses of the man he used to be. Langston Industries occupied 17 floors of a gleaming tower in Midtown, the kind of building Daniel had walked past hundreds of times without ever imagining he'd have reason to enter. The lobby was all marble and steel with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses, and a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black granite. "Daniel Hayes," he told the receptionist, a young woman whose smile was professionally warm. "I'm starting today in—" He paused, realizing he wasn't entirely sure what his official title was supposed to be. "The Corporate Development Division," she finished smoothly. "Ms. Langston is expecting you. 37th floor, her assistant Marcus will meet you at the elevator." The ride to the 37th floor gave Daniel time to study his reflection in the polished doors. He looked professional, competent even. But underneath the new shirt and fresh shave, he could still feel the uncertainty that came with being perpetually one crisis away from losing everything again. Marcus was waiting, as promised, his expression neutral, but not unfriendly. "Daniel, good to see you again. Are you ready for this? As ready as someone can be for a job they don't entirely understand yet." Marcus chuckled as he led Daniel through a maze of offices and conference rooms. That's probably the most honest thing anyone's said in this building in years. You'll fit in better than you think. Vivian's office was a corner suite, with windows on two sides, offering views of Central Park and the Hudson River. She was standing at one of those windows when they entered, silhouetted against the morning light, in a way that made her seem both powerful and somehow vulnerable. "Daniel." She turned, and her smile was genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that transformed her entire face. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted, "but grateful." "Good. Terror keeps you sharp." She gestured to a sitting area away from her desk, two comfortable chairs arranged around a small table. "Before we talk about your specific role, I want you to understand what we're really doing here." They settled into the chairs, and Daniel noticed that up close, Vivian looked tired in a way that expensive makeup couldn't quite hide. There were shadows under her eyes, fine lines around her mouth that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. "I've been running this company for 8 years," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd thought deeply about what she was saying. "We started as a traditional management consulting firm, helping companies streamline operations and maximize profits. We were good at it, very good. But somewhere along the way, I realized we were helping to create exactly the kind of workplace culture that would have ground someone like you up and spit you out without a second thought." Daniel shifted in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we were teaching executives to see employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, instead of human beings with families and dreams and problems that sometimes interfere with productivity." She paused, looking out at the city below. "Last month, we finished a project with a manufacturing company. Our recommendations resulted in a 15% increase in efficiency and a 12% reduction in operating costs. They were thrilled." "That sounds like success." "It was. Until I found out that the reduction in operating costs meant laying off 300 people right before Christmas." Vivian's voice was quiet, but Daniel could hear the pain in it. 300 families who suddenly had no income, no health insurance, no way to provide for their children during the holidays. All so that the profit margins could look better on the quarterly report. Daniel thought about his own experience with corporate downsizing, the way he'd been let go from his last job with 2 weeks' notice and a form letter thanking him for his service. That's the way business works, isn't it? Companies have to make hard choices to stay competitive. Do they? Vivian leaned forward, her eyes intense. Or have we just accepted a system that prioritizes short-term profits over human dignity? What if there was a different way? What kind of different way? What if we could teach executives to see their employees the way you saw me, that night at the bus stop, not as a problem to be solved or a resource to be maximized, but as a human being who deserves compassion and respect? She stood up and walked to her desk, returning with a thick folder. "That's what I want you to help me figure out." Daniel opened the folder to find research studies, corporate case studies, and what looked like the beginning of a curriculum outline. "You want me to design training programs. I want you to revolutionize the way businesses think about their people." Vivian's voice was gaining momentum, the way it might when she was pitching to potential clients. "Most corporate training focuses on efficiency, productivity, profit optimization. What I'm proposing is something entirely different. Empathy training, compassion workshops, teaching leaders how to make decisions that account for the human cost, not just the financial benefit." Daniel flipped through the pages, trying to process what he was seeing. "This is ambitious. It's necessary." Vivian sat back down, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd found their mission. "Do you know what the #1 cause of employee turnover is? It's not low wages or lack of benefits. It's feeling unvalued. feeling like their humanity doesn't matter to the people making decisions about their lives. And you think I can change that? I think you understand something that most executives have forgotten or never learned in the first place. She reached across and touched the folder he was holding. You know what it feels like to be discarded by a system that doesn't see you as a person. But more importantly, you've maintained your capacity for kindness despite that experience. That's not something they teach in business school. Daniel closed the folder, his mind racing. The scope of what she was proposing was staggering, essentially asking him to help reshape corporate culture from the inside out. Where do we even start? With our own company? Vivian smiled, and there was something almost mischievous about it. I've scheduled a mandatory workshop for all department heads next Friday. You'll be leading it. Next Friday. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. That's less than a week away. Is that a problem? Daniel looked at her, this woman who'd tracked down his phone number based on a chance encounter, and offered him a job that didn't exist until she decided to create it. Who was asking him to stand in front of executives and teach them how to be human? Who believed in him more than he believed in himself? No, he said finally. It's not a problem. The week that followed was a blur of preparation and learning. Vivian had given Daniel access to her personal office when she was in meetings, a quiet space where he could work without the curious stares of employees who were undoubtedly wondering who the new guy was and why he had the boss's ear. He spent hours researching corporate training methodologies, studying psychology texts about emotional intelligence, and trying to figure out how to translate his lived experience into something that could actually help other people. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was designing a program about workplace empathy, while many of his soon-to-be colleagues probably made more in a month than he'd seen in the past year. But Vivian had insisted that his outsider perspective was exactly what made him valuable. They need to hear from someone who's been on the receiving end of corporate indifference, she'd told him during one of their daily check-ins. Someone who can help them understand the real impact of their decisions. On Wednesday evening, as Daniel was packing up his materials in Vivian's office, she appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of smile that suggested she had something on her mind. "How's the preparation going?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his temporary workspace. "Good, I think. Terrifying, but good." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you really doing this?" "The program, the job, all of it." He studied her face, looking for tells. "Because helping people is nice and all, but you didn't build a successful company by making decisions based purely on altruism." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee, as if it held answers to questions she'd been avoiding. "Do you remember what I told you about my father, about the drawing I made for him? You said he threw it away." "He did. But that wasn't the worst part." She looked up and Daniel could see old pain in her eyes. "The worst part was that when I confronted him about it, when I asked him why he didn't want my picture, he looked at me like I was a problem he needed to solve. Not his daughter. Not a little girl who just wanted her daddy to love her. Just an inconvenience that was interfering with more important things." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm sorry. I spent the next 30 years trying to prove that I was worth his attention. Built this company, made more money than he ever did, showed him that I could be just as ruthless and focused as he was." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And somewhere along the way, I became exactly like him. I started seeing people as problems to be solved instead of human beings to be valued." "What changed?" "You did." The words were simple, but they hit Daniel like a physical force. "That night at the bus stop when you gave me your jacket, it was the first time in years that someone saw me as just a person, not a CEO or a client or an opportunity, just someone who was cold and needed help. Daniel set down his coffee, understanding beginning to dawn. So this is about changing yourself as much as changing the company. Maybe more. Vivian stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. I want to learn how to be human again, Daniel. And I want to help other people do the same thing. Because if we can change how one company treats its people, maybe we can start changing how business works in general. That's a hell of a goal. It is. Too ambitious. Daniel thought about Noah, about the custody hearing where his financial struggles had been used as evidence of his unfitness as a father. About all the people he'd met in shelters and soup kitchens who'd lost jobs not because they were incompetent, but because they'd become inconvenient during some corporate restructuring. About the way the system seemed designed to grind up anyone who couldn't keep up with its relentless pace. No, he said finally. Not too ambitious. Necessary. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made the city feel electric with possibility. Daniel had barely slept, running through his presentation in his mind, trying to anticipate questions and objections from an audience that would undoubtedly be skeptical of his qualifications and his message. The conference room on the 39th floor was intimidating in its perfection, polished table that could seat 20 state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Manhattan. 15 department heads filed in over the course of 10 minutes, their body language ranging from curious to resigned to openly hostile. Daniel recognized the types immediately, the older executive who clearly resented having his time wasted on what he probably saw as touchy-feely nonsense. The ambitious younger managers who were trying to figure out which way the political wind was blowing. The few who seemed genuinely interested in what he might have to say. Vivian introduced him briefly, her words carefully chosen to establish his authority without revealing too much about his personal circumstances. Daniel Hayes is our new Director of Organizational Development. He'll be leading our initiative to integrate empathy-based leadership practices into our corporate culture. Director of Organizational Development. Daniel still couldn't quite believe that was his title, that he was standing in a conference room full of people who made six-figure salaries and probably lived in apartments that cost more per month than he used to make in a year. Thank you, Vivian. Daniel looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. I want to start with a simple question. How many of you have ever been fired? The question hung in the air like a challenge. A few hands went up hesitantly, then a few more as people realized they weren't alone in the experience. Good. Now, how many of you have ever had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries? Fewer hands this time, but still some. Daniel could see Vivian watching from the back of the room, her expression unreadable. How many of you have ever had to explain to your children why Christmas might be different this year, because daddy or mommy lost their job? Only two hands now, and Daniel could see the discomfort rippling through the room. This wasn't what they'd expected from a corporate training session. I have, Daniel said quietly, all of those things and more. And I'm not sharing that to make you uncomfortable, but to help you understand something important about the decisions you make in this room every day. He clicked to his first slide, which showed a simple organizational chart with names and job titles. This is how most executives see their workforce. Names, titles, salary ranges, productivity metrics. He clicked again, and the chart transformed each box, now containing a photograph and personal details. This is who they actually are. Sarah, single mother of two, working 2 jobs to pay for her daughter's asthma medication. Marcus, Recent college graduate drowning in student loans trying to save enough money to propose to his girlfriend. Jennifer caring for her elderly father while managing a team of 12 people. The room was completely silent now, all trace of earlier skepticism replaced by focused attention. Every time you make a decision about staffing, about budgets, about operational changes, you're not just moving numbers around on a spreadsheet. You're affecting real people with real lives and real problems. Daniel paused, letting that sink in. The question is, does that matter to you? For the next hour, Daniel walked them through exercises designed to help them see their employees as complete human beings rather than just workers. He shared statistics about the correlation between empathetic leadership and employee satisfaction, productivity, and retention. He told stories carefully anonymized about people he'd met who'd been destroyed by corporate decisions made without regard for human impact. But the real turning point came when Rebecca Chen, the head of human resources, raised her hand during the Q&A session. "This all sounds wonderful in theory," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "But at the end of the day, we have shareholders to answer to. We have profit targets to meet. How do we balance empathy with the bottom line?" Daniel had been waiting for this question, the one that got to the heart of everything he was trying to accomplish. "Can I tell you about a company called Salesforce?" he asked, clicking to a new slide. 5 years ago, their CEO discovered that women in the company were being paid less than men for the same work. Fixing that pay gap cost them $3 million in the first year alone. Rebecca nodded. "Exactly my point. That's $3 million that could have gone to shareholders." "You're right. But here's what happened next." Daniel clicked again, showing a graph of Salesforce's stock performance over the following years. Employee satisfaction went up 40%. Productivity increased. Turnover dropped dramatically, saving them millions in recruitment and training costs. Their reputation as an employer of choice helped them attract top talent away from competitors. And their stock price tripled. The room was listening intently now, and Daniel could see the shift in their attention, from polite skepticism to genuine interest. The $3 million they spent on pay equity wasn't a cost, he continued. It was an investment. An investment in treating their people like human beings instead of expendable resources. And it paid off in ways that went far beyond the bottom line. Thomas Brennan, the CFO, leaned forward. "You're saying that empathy is profitable. I'm saying that companies that treat their employees with dignity and respect consistently outperform companies that don't." Daniel clicked through several more case studies, each one showing the business benefits of empathetic leadership. "But more than that, I'm saying that profitability and humanity don't have to be mutually exclusive." "That's a nice ideal," said Patricia Wong from marketing. "But it assumes that employees will respond positively to being treated better. What about the people who see kindness as weakness, who take advantage of empathetic managers?" Daniel smiled, recognizing the cynicism that came from years of corporate experience. "You know what I've learned? Most people will rise or fall to the level of expectation you set for them. If you treat your employees like they're lazy, dishonest, or incompetent, many of them will become exactly that. But if you treat them like valuable human beings who want to do good work and contribute something meaningful, most of them will surprise you." "And the ones who don't," Patricia pressed. "Then you deal with those individuals appropriately. But you don't design your entire management philosophy around the assumption that everyone is going to disappoint you." Daniel paused, thinking about his own experience with managers who'd written him off before giving him a chance. Because when you do that, you create exactly the kind of toxic workplace culture that drives away your best people and keeps your worst. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, ranging from practical implementation issues to philosophical challenges about the role of emotion in business decisions. Daniel found himself energized by the discussion, drawing on everything he'd learned during his research, but also on his lived experience of being on the receiving end of both compassionate and indifferent leadership. As the session wound down, Vivian stepped forward. "I want to thank Daniel for what I think was an eye-opening presentation. Over the next few weeks, we'll be implementing some of the strategies he's outlined across all departments. This isn't optional, and it isn't a temporary initiative. This is who we're becoming as a company." After the executives filed out some still deep in conversation about what they'd heard, Daniel found himself alone with Vivian in the conference room. The adrenaline that had carried him through the presentation was beginning to fade, leaving him drained, but oddly exhilarated. "How do you think it went?" he asked, beginning to pack up his materials. "I think you just changed some minds," Vivian said, and there was something like pride in her voice. "Rebecca came up to me afterward. She wants to pilot a mentorship program in HR pairing senior employees with junior staff to provide career guidance and personal support." "Really? Really? And Thomas wants to meet with you next week to discuss incorporating employee impact assessments into budget planning processes." Vivian moved to help him gather his papers. "You did something remarkable today, Daniel. You made empathy sound like good business." "It is good business. It just took me a while to figure out how to prove it." They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Daniel found himself thinking about how surreal his life had become in just 2 weeks. From living in a truck to leading corporate training sessions, from wondering where his next meal was coming from, to having colleagues who wanted to implement his ideas. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said, as they finished packing up. "Sure." "The custody hearing for Noah. When is it?" Daniel's hands stilled on the papers he was organizing. He hadn't told her about the hearing that was scheduled for next month, the one that would determine whether his new job and stable income were enough to convince a judge that he deserved another chance at being Noah's father. "How did you—" "Marcus did some research, legal research." Vivian's expression was carefully neutral. "I wanted to understand what we might be able to do to help." Daniel, you're not just an employee here. What happened between us that night, what you're doing for this company, it matters to me, personally." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I've arranged for you to meet with Catherine Morrison next Tuesday. She's one of the best family law attorneys in the city." Daniel felt something twist in his stomach. "I can't afford—" "It's handled. Consider it a signing bonus." "Vivian, I can't let you—" "You're not letting me do anything." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "I'm making a business decision. You're valuable to this company, and employees who are worried about personal legal issues don't perform at their best. This is an investment in your ability to focus on your work." Daniel stared at her, trying to process what she was offering. A meeting with one of the city's top family lawyers, probably worth more than he'd made in his last 6 months of employment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why are you doing all this?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city beyond the conference room windows. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. "Because that night at the bus stop, you gave me something I didn't even know I'd lost. Hope. The belief that people can still choose to be kind, even when the world has given them every reason not to be." She turned back to him, and Daniel could see vulnerability in her expression that he suspected few people ever witnessed. "I want to help you get your son back, Daniel. But more than that, I want to learn how to be the kind of person who gives their jacket to a stranger without expecting anything in return." "You already are that person," Daniel said quietly. "This job, the lawyer, all of it you're giving without expecting anything back." "Am I?" Or am I trying to buy my way into feeling better about myself? The question hung between them, honest and raw, in a way that corporate conversations rarely were. Daniel thought about it seriously, studying Vivian's face, thinking about everything that had happened since that night at the bus stop. "I think," he said finally, "that motivations can be complicated. Maybe you started this because you felt guilty or wanted to fix something in yourself. But what you're actually doing, changing how this company treats people, giving me a chance to rebuild my life, that's real. That helps real people, regardless of why you're doing it. And if I am trying to buy my way into being a better person, then at least you're paying the right price." Vivian smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "You know, I think this is going to work out just fine." As Daniel left the Langston Industries building that evening, walking through the lobby that had intimidated him just a week earlier, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the confidence that came from being good at something that mattered. The workshop had gone better than he'd dared to hope, and the enthusiasm he'd seen from some of the department heads suggested that maybe, just maybe, they could actually change something. But more than professional satisfaction, he felt a growing sense of possibility about his personal life. The meeting with the family lawyer might not guarantee anything, but it was a chance, a real chance, to make his case for why he deserved to have Noah back. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Daniel's heart jumped when he saw it was from Eleanor Morrison, Noah's grandmother. For a moment, he feared the worst, some emergency or complication with the custody arrangement. Instead, the message was brief and surprising. "Noah has been asking about you. Would you like to have dinner with us Sunday 6 p.m.? Daniel read the message 3 times, hardly believing what he was seeing. The Morrisons had been polite but distant since the custody hearing, following the court-mandated visitation schedule, but making it clear that they considered his presence in Noah's life to be temporary at best. He typed back quickly, "I would love that. Thank you." The response came almost immediately, "Good. Noah will be so happy." As Daniel walked toward the subway that would take him back to his truck, hopefully, for one of the last times, he found himself thinking about the strange way life had of surprising you just when you'd given up hope. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a man with nothing to offer anyone, living day to day and wondering if he'd ever see his son again. Now he had a job that felt like a calling. Colleagues who were starting to implement his ideas, and a dinner invitation from the people who'd been taking care of his son. It wasn't everything. Noah still wasn't coming home, and there were no guarantees about what the custody hearing would bring. But it was movement in the right direction. Momentum that felt sustainable in a way that desperate optimism never had. And at the center of it all was Vivian Langston, a woman who'd started as a stranger at a bus stop and become something Daniel wasn't quite ready to name. Their relationship was complicated, employer and employee, but also 2 people who'd recognized something in each other that night in the cold. 2 people who were learning together how to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate disappointments. As the train pulled into the station, Daniel caught his reflection in the window and saw something he hadn't seen in months, a man with a future worth fighting for. The Sunday dinner invitation felt like stepping into an alternate universe where Daniel actually belonged at his son's table. He stood outside the Morrison house in Westchester at exactly 5:55 p.m. holding a bouquet of flowers for Eleanor and a small wrapped gift for Noah, a book about shepherds that he'd found at a used bookstore, thinking about the Christmas pageant and his son's proud moment on stage. The house was everything Daniel remembered from better times. Colonial style with white columns, a perfectly manicured lawn even in December, and the kind of quiet suburban prosperity that spoke of retirement accounts and college funds and all the stability he'd once been able to provide. Now it felt like visiting a museum of the life he'd lost. Noah answered the door before Daniel could even ring the bell, his face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy that only children possess. "Daddy, you came—" He launched himself into Daniel's arms with enough force to nearly knock him backward. "Of course I came, buddy. I wouldn't miss it." Daniel held his son tight, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the lingering smell of whatever art project he'd been working on. "You've gotten taller. Grandma says I'm having a growth spurt. She's making pot roast because I told her it's your favorite." Daniel's throat tightened. He'd mentioned that once, months ago, during one of their supervised visits, not expecting Noah to remember or care enough to pass it along. "Well, let's not keep Grandma waiting then." Eleanor Morrison appeared in the doorway behind Noah, and Daniel was struck by how much she'd aged in the months since the custody hearing. Her gray hair seemed thinner, her movements more careful, and there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Daniel." She nodded, accepting the flowers with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Thank you. These are lovely." "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Morrison. It means more than you know." She studied his appearance, the pressed shirt, the clean shave, the general air of someone who was getting back on their feet, and Daniel could see her making calculations, reassessing whatever assumptions she'd been carrying about his trajectory. "You look well," she said finally. "Noah, why don't you show your father to the living room while I check on dinner?" The living room was a shrine to Noah's childhood, with photographs chronicling every milestone Daniel had missed over the past 14 months. First day of school, Halloween costumes, soccer team photos, birthday parties. Each image was a small stab of loss, a reminder of all the moments that had happened without him. "Look, Daddy." Noah pulled him toward the fireplace mantel, where a new addition caught Daniel's attention immediately. It was the drawing from his jacket pocket, the one with stick figures and crayon declarations of love now carefully framed and displayed alongside professional family portraits. "Grandma put it there after you came to my pageant," Noah said proudly. "She said it was too special to keep in a drawer." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "What else has been going on? Tell me everything." For the next 20 minutes, Noah chattered away about school and friends and the hamster his class had gotten as a pet. Daniel listened with the focused attention of someone trying to absorb 14 months of his child's life in a single conversation, storing away every detail like precious cargo. George Morrison emerged from his study just as Eleanor called them to dinner, and his greeting was warmer than Daniel had expected. George had always been the more approachable of Noah's grandparents, a retired insurance executive who'd built model airplanes with Noah and taught him to play chess. "Daniel, good to see you." His handshake was firm, his assessment frank, but not unkind. "Eleanor tells me you've found steady employment." "Yes, sir. I'm working for Langston Industries in Manhattan. Corporate consulting." "Langston Industries." George's eyebrows rose. "Impressive. Vivian Langston has quite a reputation in business circles. Sharp woman." "She is. She's been instrumental in helping me get back on my feet." They settled around the dining room table, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to pretend this was normal Sunday dinner with his son and the extended family, the kind of ordinary domestic scene he'd taken for granted in his previous life. Eleanor had indeed made pot roast along with mashed potatoes and green beans and homemade rolls that filled the house with the scent of comfort and care. "Daddy, guess what?" Noah said around a mouthful of potatoes. "I got an A on my book report." "That's fantastic, buddy. What book did you write about?" "Charlotte's Web. It's about friendship and how sometimes you have to be brave to save the people you love." Daniel felt Eleanor's eyes on him across the table, and when he met her gaze, he saw something unexpected there. Not hostility or judgment, but a kind of careful hope. "That's a good lesson," Daniel said. "Being brave for the people you love." "Yeah, like how you gave your jacket to that lady, even though you were cold too. Grandma told me about it." The conversation stopped, all adult eyes turning to Eleanor, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have done some research," she said quietly. "After Noah's pageant, when I saw how you looked, how you carried yourself, I wanted to understand what had changed. You researched me. I Googled you, found some articles about Langston Industries, their new corporate empathy initiative. Saw your name mentioned as the director." Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, but Daniel could hear the underlying emotion. "Then I called someone I know at the company, asked a few discreet questions." "Eleanor," George said, his tone gently chiding, "we discussed this. I had to know if this was real, or if it was just another false start." Eleanor looked directly at Daniel, her eyes challenging him to be offended. "Noah has been through enough disappointment. We all have." Daniel set down his fork, understanding that this dinner was more than a social courtesy. It was an evaluation, a chance for them to assess whether he was truly climbing out of the hole he'd fallen into, or just putting on a temporary show. "You're right to be careful," he said finally. "I've made a lot of promises I couldn't keep over the past year. Given you reasons not to trust that things would get better." "You lost your wife," George said quietly. "You were grieving. We understood that. Understanding and trusting someone with your grandchild's emotional well-being are two different things." Eleanor's words were harsh, but not cruel. "I watched Noah cry himself to sleep after visits with you, Daniel. Watched him ask why his daddy couldn't come home with him. Do you know how that feels?" "No," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know how it feels to be the reason your child is crying. And I know I can't undo that damage with apologies or promises. I can only try to do better going forward." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history and tentative hope. "Tell me about your job," Eleanor said finally. "What exactly do you do for Vivian Langston?" Daniel found himself describing the empathy initiative, the workshops he'd been conducting, the way companies were starting to recognize that treating employees as whole human beings rather than productivity units actually improved business outcomes. He talked about the case studies he'd compiled, the feedback he'd received from department heads, the growing interest from other corporations who wanted to implement similar programs. "It sounds meaningful," George observed. "Like you're making a real difference." "I hope so. It feels like the first time in years that I'm doing something that actually matters." Daniel glanced at Noah, who was listening with the serious attention children give to conversations they don't entirely understand, but sense are important. "And it pays well enough that I can provide for Noah properly." "Money isn't everything," Eleanor said, but her tone had softened. "Though I'll admit it helps with stability." "Speaking of which," George said, his voice carefully casual, "I understand you have a custody hearing coming up." Daniel nodded, his stomach tightening. "Next month. My lawyer thinks we have a good chance given the changes in my circumstances." "Your lawyer?" "Catherine Morrison. No relation," Daniel added quickly, seeing Eleanor's startled expression. "She specializes in family law. Came highly recommended." What he didn't mention was that Vivian had not only arranged the introduction, but was quietly funding the legal fees, something that had sparked a complicated mix of gratitude and guilt in Daniel. He was getting his life back together, but not entirely through his own efforts, and that dependence felt uncomfortably similar to the helplessness he'd been fighting to escape. "Catherine Morrison is excellent," George said. "Expensive, but excellent. She handled a custody case for a friend of mine a few years back." The rest of dinner passed more easily, conversation flowing between Noah's school activities, Daniel's work, and carefully neutral topics that didn't require anyone to address the elephant in the room. Whether this evening represented a new beginning or just a temporary reprieve from the awkwardness that had defined their relationship since the custody hearing. After dessert, Eleanor sent Noah to get ready for bed, while she and George cleared the table, leaving Daniel alone in the living room with his thoughts. The house felt different than he remembered, less like foreign territory, and more like a place where he might actually be welcome given time and consistent proof of his reliability. "Daddy." Noah appeared in pajamas, his hair damp from washing. "Will you read me a story?" Daniel looked toward the kitchen where Eleanor was loading the dishwasher, with movements that suggested she was listening for his response. "If it's okay with Grandma." "It's fine," Eleanor called back, though her voice carried the weight of someone making a significant concession. "Just one story, though. It's already past his bedtime." Noah's room was exactly what Daniel would have expected: neat, without being sterile, filled with books and games, and the comfortable clutter of a well-loved child. The walls were covered with artwork and achievement certificates and photographs, including several that Daniel hadn't seen before. Noah at his new school. Noah with friends he didn't recognize. Noah learning to ride a bike with George running alongside. "I missed you, Daddy," Noah said quietly, as they settled onto his bed with a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "I missed you too, buddy. More than you can imagine." "Are you going to come home soon?" The question was simple, direct in the way only children's questions could be, and it cut through all of Daniel's carefully prepared explanations about legal processes and gradual transitions. "I'm trying," he said honestly. "There are some grown-up things that have to be worked out first, but I'm trying very hard to make that happen." Noah nodded solemnly, accepting this the way children accept most adult complications, as mysterious but presumably manageable problems that the grown-ups would eventually solve. They read the story together, Noah following along with words he'd memorized from countless previous readings, and for a few minutes Daniel allowed himself to feel like a father again, rather than a visitor in his son's life. "I love you, Noah," he said, as he tucked the covers around his son's small frame. "I love you too, Daddy, and I'm proud of you. Proud of me, for helping people at your job, for being brave like Charlotte." Daniel kissed his son's forehead, breathing in the scent that was uniquely Noah soap and innocence, and the lingering sweetness of childhood. "Sweet dreams, buddy." Eleanor was waiting in the hallway when he emerged from Noah's room, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "He's been asking about you more lately," she said quietly. "Wanting to know when you're coming home, when things will go back to normal." "What do you tell him?" "That I don't know, because I don't." She studied his face in the shadows. "But tonight I saw something I haven't seen in a long time." "What's that?" "The father Noah remembers. The man Sarah fell in love with." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that man is back, Daniel, for Noah's sake. But I need to know this isn't temporary. I need to know you won't disappear on him again." "I never wanted to disappear in the first place." "I know. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I understand that better now than I did during the hearing." Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "George and I aren't young anymore. We love Noah desperately, but raising a child at our age, it's not what we planned for our retirement. What we want is for Noah to be with his father where he belongs, but only if that's truly what's best for him. Daniel felt hope and terror warring in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that if this job is real, if this stability is real, if you can prove to the court that you're capable of providing the kind of home Noah deserves, then we won't contest the custody change. Eleanor's words were measured, deliberate. But if you let him down again, if you put him through another cycle of hope and disappointment, I will fight you with everything I have. You won't have to. I'm not the same man I was during the hearing. I hope not, for all our sakes. The drive back to Manhattan gave Daniel time to process what had happened. The dinner had been a test, but not the kind he'd expected. Instead of evaluating his financial stability or his professional prospects, Eleanor had been looking for something more fundamental, evidence that he'd found his way back to being the kind of man who deserved to raise a child. And somehow, impossibly, he seemed to have passed. His phone rang as he was navigating the city, traffic, Vivian's name appearing on the caller ID. Daniel answered through the truck's ancient Bluetooth system, her voice filling the cab with warmth that surprised him. "How did dinner go?" she asked without preamble. "Better than I expected. Much better." Daniel found himself smiling as he spoke. "I think they might actually support the custody change." "That's wonderful news. I knew they would come around once they saw how you've changed." "How did you know I'd changed? Sometimes I'm not even sure myself." Vivian was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could almost hear her thinking through whatever she wanted to say. "Can I tell you something?" she said finally. "When I was growing up, my father used to bring me to his office sometimes during school breaks. I would sit in the corner of his conference room while he met with clients, and I remember being fascinated by how different he was there. At home, he was distant, distracted, always thinking about work. But in those meetings, he was completely present, completely engaged with whatever problem needed solving." "Sounds like he cared about his work." "He did. But what I realized years later was that he cared about his work more than he cared about his family. The attention and focus he gave to clients he never gave to me or my mother." Vivian paused, and Daniel could hear traffic sounds on her end of the call. "That night at the bus stop when you gave me your jacket, I saw something I'd never seen before in a business context. Someone who cared more about a stranger's immediate need than about protecting himself. It was just a jacket. It was everything you had to keep warm, and you gave it to someone you'd never see again. That's not just kindness, Daniel. That's the kind of selflessness that can't be taught or faked. It's character." Daniel felt something warm spread through his chest, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or professional respect. "The custody hearing," he said. "If things go well, if I get Noah back." "When you get Noah back," Vivian corrected firmly. "When I get Noah back, things will change. My schedule, my priorities. I won't be able to work the same hours or travel if the job requires it." "Are you trying to talk yourself out of success?" "I'm trying to be realistic about what I can offer you as an employee if I'm a full-time father." Vivian laughed, a sound that was both amused and affectionate. "Daniel, do you know what the single biggest complaint I hear from executives is? They feel disconnected from their families because work demands too much of their time and attention. You're going to teach companies how to create cultures that support employee well-being, and you're worried that being a good father will make you less effective at your job." The irony was so obvious once she pointed it out that Daniel felt slightly foolish for not seeing it himself. I guess that would kind of undermine the message, wouldn't it? Just a little. Besides, some of our best insights come from real experience. If we're asking companies to support working parents, it helps to have someone on the team who actually is one. They talked for another 20 minutes, while Daniel drove through the city, their conversation ranging from upcoming projects to Noah's excitement about possibly coming home to the strange way their professional relationship had become something deeper and more complicated than either of them had expected. By the time Daniel reached the parking garage where he'd been keeping his truck, a step up from alley parking, made possible by his first paycheck from Langston Industries, he felt more optimistic about the future than he had in months. The custody hearing was still 3 weeks away, but tonight had proven that change was possible, that people could look past your worst moments and see potential for something better. His phone buzzed with a text message as he was settling into the truck's cab. Another message from Eleanor, brief and unexpected. "Thank you for tonight. It was good to see you smile again." Daniel stared at the message, reading it several times before responding. "Thank you for giving me the chance. It won't be wasted." The response came quickly. "I know. Sleep well, Daniel." As he prepared for another night in the truck, hopefully one of his last, Daniel found himself thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he'd been a man with nothing to offer anyone, surviving day to day and wondering if he'd ever see his son again. Tonight, he was someone with a job that mattered, colleagues who respected his ideas, and the realistic possibility of getting his family back. And at the center of it all was Vivian Langston, a woman who'd seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. Their relationship defied easy categorization. Employer and employee, certainly, but also two people who'd recognized something essential in each other during a moment of crisis. Daniel pulled out his laptop and spent an hour working on his presentation for the following week, a workshop for the marketing department about incorporating empathy into client communications. But his mind kept drifting to the dinner conversation, to Noah's proud declaration about being brave for the people you love, to Eleanor's cautious hope that the father, her grandson remembered, might actually be coming home. Change was possible. He'd seen it in Vivian's transformation, from the shivering stranger at the bus stop to the purposeful executive reshaping her company's culture. He'd seen it in his own journey from homelessness to professional respect. And now maybe he was seeing it in the Morrisons' willingness to consider that he deserved another chance at being Noah's father. The custody hearing was still 3 weeks away, but for the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel felt like he was moving toward something instead of just running from his past. And that made all the difference in the world. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of penetrating dampness that made Daniel grateful for the warm office waiting for him at Langston Industries. He'd moved into a small studio apartment in Queens over the weekend. Nothing fancy, but it had heat and hot water, and an address that would look respectable on custody paperwork. The meeting with Catherine Morrison was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Daniel arrived at her law office 15 minutes early, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still in the elegant waiting room. The office was everything he'd expected from one of the city's top family lawyers. Mahogany furniture, law books that actually looked like they'd been read, and diplomas from Harvard and Columbia prominently displayed. Catherine Morrison herself was younger than Daniel had expected, probably in her early 40s, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. She greeted him with a firm handshake and led him into her private office, where a thick file was already waiting on her desk. "Mr. Hayes, I've reviewed your case materials, and I have to say, your circumstances have changed dramatically since the original custody ruling." She opened the file, scanning documents as she spoke. "New employment, with substantial income, increased stable housing, positive character references from colleagues. It's quite a transformation." "I've had help," Daniel admitted. "Good people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Vivian Langston being chief among them, I assume." Catherine's tone was neutral, But Daniel caught something in her expression, curiosity maybe, or mild concern. She gave me a chance when no one else would. I owe her everything. Gratitude is admirable, Mr. Hayes, but I want to make sure you understand that dependency can be problematic in custody cases. The court needs to see that your stability is sustainable, not contingent on the continued goodwill of a single individual. Daniel felt a chill of worry. Are you saying my relationship with Vivian could hurt the case? I'm saying we need to present your situation in a way that emphasizes your own capabilities and growth, not your reliance on external support. Catherine leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same intensity he'd seen Vivian use during business meetings. Tell me about your job. Not the salary or the title, but what you actually do day to day. For the next 30 minutes, Daniel described his work at Langston Industries, the workshops he conducted, the corporate culture changes he was helping to implement, the positive feedback he'd received from clients and colleagues. As he talked, he realized that what had started as a job offer born of gratitude had evolved into something much more substantial. He wasn't just Vivian's charity case anymore. He was genuinely good at what he did. Excellent, Catherine said when he finished. That's exactly the narrative we want to present. You're not someone who was rescued by a benevolent employer. You're someone who overcame adversity and found work that utilizes your unique skills and experience. What about the fact that I was homeless? That's not going to just disappear from the record. No, but it's not necessarily disqualifying either. Homelessness is often temporary, and in your case it was clearly the result of extraordinary circumstances, your wife's illness and death, medical debt, job loss. The question isn't whether you hit rock bottom, it's whether you've demonstrated the ability to climb back out. Catherine walked him through the legal process, explaining what to expect during the hearing, what questions might be asked, how the judge would evaluate his fitness as a parent. It was thorough and professional, but Daniel found himself wondering what Vivian had told her about his situation, what private conversations had taken place before this meeting. One more thing, Catherine said as they wrapped up. I understand the child's maternal grandparents have been supportive of your recent changes. Yes, more than I expected, honestly. Good. Their testimony could be crucial. Grandparents who willingly support a custody change despite having physical and legal custody themselves carry significant weight with judges. She made a note in the file. I'll want to speak with them before the hearing. As Daniel left the law office, he felt cautiously optimistic about his chances. Catherine Morrison knew her business, and she seemed genuinely confident that they could make a compelling case for custody modification. But her comments about dependency nagged at him, raising questions about his relationship with Vivian that he'd been avoiding. Was he really as independent as he wanted to believe, or was he just trading one form of vulnerability for another? And what would happen to his carefully rebuilt life if Vivian decided she no longer needed his services? The questions followed him back to Langston Industries, where he found Vivian waiting in his office with coffee and the kind of smile that made his concerns seem both more urgent and less important. How did it go with Catherine? She asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Good. She thinks we have a strong case. Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully, using the pause to study Vivian's expression. She also mentioned that dependency can be an issue in custody cases. Dependency. The perception that my stability is contingent on your continued support rather than my own capabilities. Vivian was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could see her processing the implications. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. Is that what you think? That you're dependent on me? I think I owe you more than I can ever repay. I think my life would be very different right now if you hadn't decided to track me down after that night at the bus stop. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. But I also think I've earned my place here. The work I'm doing, the results we're seeing, that's not charity. That's value I'm providing to the company. It is, and I want to make sure the court sees it that way too. Vivian leaned forward, her expression intense. What if we restructured your employment contract, made it clear that your position is based on performance metrics rather than personal relationship? Include termination clauses that protect both parties, salary reviews tied to objective measures of success. You'd do that. I'd do that to protect your custody case, yes. But more than that, I'd do it because you've proven that you don't need special treatment to succeed here. You're good at this job, Daniel. You deserve to hold it on your own merits. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Webb appearing in the doorway, his expression suggesting urgent business. Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The Henderson Industries account. They're threatening to pull out of the empathy training program. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Henderson Industries was their biggest client for the new initiative, a manufacturing company with 15,000 employees across 6 states. Losing them wouldn't just be a financial blow. It would be a public relations disaster that could undermine everything they were trying to build. What happened? Vivian asked, her professional persona snapping into place. Their CEO got wind that the program was designed by someone who was recently homeless. He's concerned about the optics of having his executives trained by what he called someone who couldn't manage his own life. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about how his past would follow him despite his professional success. That's ridiculous, Vivian said sharply. Daniel's background is exactly what makes him effective at this job. Try explaining that to Robert Henderson. He wants to meet with you this afternoon to discuss alternative arrangements. Daniel stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. I'll resign. If my presence is hurting the company, I'll step aside. Absolutely not. Vivian's voice was steel. You will not sacrifice your career because one narrow-minded executive can't see past his own prejudices. But if Henderson pulls out, then we'll find other clients, better clients who understand what we're actually offering. Vivian was on her feet now, pacing with the restless energy she displayed when confronted with a challenge. Marcus set up the meeting, but make it clear that Daniel is not just the designer of this program, he's the director of the entire division. Henderson can take it or leave it, but we're not changing our personnel to accommodate his comfort level. Vivian, that's a huge financial risk, Marcus said. Henderson represents almost 30% of our revenue for this quarter. I don't care. Some principles are worth more than money. As Marcus left to arrange the meeting, Daniel found himself staring at Vivian, trying to process what had just happened. She was willing to risk a major client, potentially millions in revenue, to protect his position. It was loyalty beyond anything he'd expected, but it also highlighted the complexity of their relationship in ways that made him uncomfortable. You can't keep making exceptions for me, he said quietly. Catherine was right about the dependency issue. If I'm going to be successful here, if I'm going to get Noah back, I need to stand on my own merits. You are standing on your own merits. Henderson's prejudice doesn't change the quality of your work or the results you've achieved. But it does change how people perceive my role here, and perception matters especially in custody proceedings. Vivian stopped pacing, turning to face him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What are you suggesting? Let me handle Henderson myself. Not as someone you're protecting, but as the director of this division making a business case for why the program works. Daniel felt certainty settling over him like armor. If I can't convince him that my background is an asset rather than a liability, then maybe Catherine's concerns are justified. And if you can't convince him, if Henderson pulls out anyway, then we deal with that when it happens. But at least we'll know I tried to solve the problem instead of hiding from it. Vivian studied his face for a long moment, and Daniel could see her weighing risks and possibilities, corporate strategy, against personal loyalty. "All right," she said finally, "but I'm coming with you. Not to protect you or speak for you, but because this is my company, and Henderson needs to understand that these decisions come from the top." The meeting with Robert Henderson was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the conference room on the 39th floor. Daniel spent the morning reviewing his presentation materials and practicing responses to the objections he expected to face. He'd dealt with prejudice and skepticism before, but never in a situation where so much was riding on his ability to change someone's mind. Henderson arrived precisely on time, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested old money and older attitudes. His handshake was firm but perfunctory, his assessment of Daniel frank and unfriendly. "Mr. Hayes, I have to say I was surprised to learn about your background. Ms. Langston didn't mention it when she first pitched this program." "Because it wasn't relevant to the quality of the work," Vivian said before Daniel could respond. "Just as your personal history isn't relevant to your ability to run Henderson Industries." Henderson's smile was thin. "I think we both know that's not entirely true. Leadership is about credibility, and credibility comes from a track record of making sound decisions. Mr. Hayes's recent history suggests some questionable judgment." Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced his voice to remain calm and professional. "What specifically concerns you about my background, Mr. Henderson? You were homeless. You lost custody of your own child. These aren't minor setbacks, they're indicators of fundamental problems with decision-making and personal responsibility. You're right. I made mistakes. I prioritized my dying wife's care over financial stability. I chose love over practical concerns, and when she died, I was unprepared for the economic consequences." Daniel leaned forward, meeting Henderson's gaze directly. "But those experiences taught me something that no business school can provide: what it actually feels like to be on the receiving end of corporate decisions that don't account for human cost." Henderson's expression didn't change. "That's a nice sentiment. But how does personal tragedy qualify you to advise business leaders? Because I understand what happens when companies treat their employees as expendable resources. I've lived it." Daniel clicked to his first slide showing retention statistics from companies that had implemented empathy training. "Your turnover rate is 18% above industry average. Exit interviews consistently cite feeling undervalued as the primary reason people leave. You're hemorrhaging talent because your management culture doesn't account for the human element. And you think sensitivity training is going to fix that? I think treating your employees like complete human beings instead of productivity units will reduce turnover, increase satisfaction, and ultimately improve your bottom line." Daniel clicked through his presentation, showing case study after case study of companies that had seen measurable improvements after implementing similar programs. "But more than that, I think it's the right thing to do." Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "The right thing according to whom, your moral philosophy professor? According to someone who's experienced both sides of the equation. I've been the employee who got laid off because I was seen as an inconvenient expense rather than a valuable contributor. I've also been the executive making decisions about people's livelihoods." Daniel paused, letting that sink in. The difference in perspective is what makes this program effective. For the next hour, Daniel walked Henderson through the methodology behind the empathy training, the psychological research supporting emotional intelligence in leadership, and the specific outcomes they'd measured in companies that had implemented similar programs. He answered questions about cost-benefit analysis, implementation timelines, and measurement strategies with the kind of detailed knowledge that could only come from deep expertise. But it was the personal stories, that seemed to break through Henderson's resistance examples of specific employees whose lives had been improved by managers who learned to see them as whole people, instances where empathetic leadership had prevented resignations or resolved conflicts that might otherwise have escalated. "You're asking me to fundamentally change the way my managers think about their jobs," Henderson said finally. "I'm asking you to give your managers tools that will make them more effective leaders and your employees more loyal contributors." Daniel closed his laptop, the presentation complete. "The choice is yours, Mr. Henderson, but I guarantee that continuing to operate the way you have been will cost you more in the long run than investing in this program." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel with the kind of assessment that suggested he was reevaluating his initial assumptions. "All right, Mr. Hayes, you've made your case. We'll proceed with the program as originally planned." He stood up, extending his hand. "But I'll be watching the results closely. If this doesn't deliver the outcomes you've promised, we'll be having a different conversation." "Fair enough," Daniel said, shaking Henderson's hand. "I'm confident you'll be pleased with what we accomplish together." After Henderson left, Daniel found himself alone with Vivian in the conference room, adrenaline slowly fading as the magnitude of what had just happened sank in. "That was impressive," Vivian said quietly. "You didn't just save the account, you turned a skeptic into a potential advocate." "We'll see. Henderson's not the type to be easily convinced, but at least we have a chance to prove the program works." "You know what the most impressive part was? You didn't try to hide from your past or apologize for it. You owned it and explained why it made you better at your job." Daniel looked at her, this woman who had somehow seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself, who had risked her company's reputation and financial stability to give him a chance to prove his worth. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "The job, the confidence, the opportunity to rebuild my life, all of it started with that night at the bus stop." "No, Daniel. It started with you making the choice to help a stranger who needed it. Everything that's happened since then has just been the natural consequence of that character." Vivian moved closer, and Daniel caught the scent of her perfume, something subtle and expensive that reminded him of confidence and possibility. "You were always this person. You just needed the right circumstances to remember it." Standing there in the conference room with Manhattan spreading out below them, Daniel felt something shift between them, a recognition that their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee, benefactor and grateful recipient. They were partners now in business and in the complicated project of learning how to be better people than they had been before. The custody hearing was 2 weeks away, but for the first time since Sarah's death, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do with exactly the right person beside him. And that made all the difference in the world. The custody hearing was scheduled for February 14th, Valentine's Day, a date that felt both cruelly ironic and somehow appropriate for what Daniel hoped would be the reunion of his fractured family. 2 weeks stretched ahead of him like an eternity filled with final preparations, sleepless nights, and the kind of hope that felt dangerous to hold too tightly. The evening after the Henderson meeting, Daniel found himself staying late at the office, unable to concentrate on anything except the approaching court date. He was reviewing testimony notes for the 3rd time when Vivian appeared in his doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and an expression of gentle concern. "You're going to wear yourself out if you keep this up," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Catherine Morrison knows what she's doing. Your case is solid." "Is it Henderson called me homeless to my face today? What's to stop the judge from seeing me the same way? The fact that you're not homeless anymore. The fact that you have a stable job, a steady income, and character witnesses who can testify to your transformation." Vivian leaned forward, her voice taking on the firm tone she used during important negotiations. But more than that, you have something you didn't have during the first custody hearing. What's that? Hope, purpose. The knowledge that you're not just surviving anymore, you're building something meaningful. She paused, studying his face in the lamplight. The man who gave me his jacket at that bus stop was kind but broken. The man sitting across from me now is someone who's learned to help others heal while healing himself. Daniel felt something warm unfold in his chest at her words, a recognition of truth that went deeper than professional praise or personal gratitude. I've been thinking about that night a lot lately, he said quietly. What would have happened if I'd just kept walking? If I'd been too cold or too tired or too focused on my own problems to notice someone else who needed help? But you didn't keep walking. That's what matters. Would you have found someone else, another homeless person to rescue and transform into your empathy consultant? Vivian was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her considering the question seriously rather than dismissing it as hypothetical musing. No, she said finally. I wouldn't have been looking for someone to rescue. What drew me to you wasn't your circumstances, Daniel. It was your character. The choice you made in that moment revealed something about who you are at your core, something that can't be taught or manufactured. And what's that? The ability to see past your own pain, to recognize someone else's need, to act with genuine compassion even when you have nothing to gain from it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like stars against the darkness. Do you know how rare that is? How many people I encounter every day who are so focused on their own agendas that they couldn't see a stranger's suffering if it was happening right in front of them. Daniel joined her at the window, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, close enough to see the reflection of office lights in her dark eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself, he admitted. If this whole transformation is real or just a desperate attempt to become someone worthy of getting my son back. Does it matter? If the end result is that you become a better person, a better father, someone who makes a positive difference in the world. Does the initial motivation really matter? Doesn't it? Isn't there a difference between genuine change and just performing a role until you get what you want? Vivian turned to face him directly, and Daniel was struck by the intensity of her gaze, the way she seemed to be seeing through all his carefully constructed defenses to something more essential underneath. You want to know what I think? I think you're not performing anything. I think you're finally becoming who you were always meant to be before grief and loss and financial ruin convinced you that you were worthless. Her voice was soft but certain. The kindness you showed me that night, that wasn't an act. It was the truest thing about you, the part of yourself that survived everything else. They stood there in the quiet office, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them, like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Daniel felt the pull of something deeper than professional respect or personal gratitude, a connection that had been building since that first night at the bus stop, but had remained carefully unexamined in the daylight of their working relationship. Vivian, he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say. I know, she said quietly. I feel it too. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and dangerous and impossible to take back. Daniel felt his heart racing, not just from the proximity of her, but from the recognition that his feelings for Vivian Langston had evolved far beyond anything appropriate for an employee-employer relationship. This complicates things, he said, taking a small step back from the window, from her, from the gravity of what they were acknowledging. It does, but complicated doesn't necessarily mean wrong. What about the custody hearing? If there's any perception that our relationship is anything other than professional, Then we'll deal with that if it becomes an issue. But Daniel, you can't live your entire life making decisions based on what might go wrong. Sometimes you have to take a risk on what might go right. Before he could respond, his phone rang, the harsh sound cutting through the intimacy of the moment like a knife. Eleanor Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and Daniel felt his stomach clench with automatic anxiety. "I should take this," he said, and Vivian nodded, moving back to give him privacy. "Mrs. Morrison, is everything okay?" "Daniel, I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to talk to you before the hearing next week." Eleanor's voice was strained, carrying an undertone of worry that made Daniel's chest tighten. "There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Noah's father's family. Sarah's brother Michael called today. He's been in touch with his parents, and apparently they've decided they want to contest the custody change." Daniel felt the floor drop out from under him. Michael Morrison had been largely absent from Noah's life since Sarah's death, pursuing a career in Europe that kept him conveniently distant from family obligations. But he was Noah's uncle, Sarah's brother, and if he decided to make a play for custody, on what grounds? Daniel managed to ask. "They're claiming that Noah would be better served remaining with family, that the disruption of changing households would be traumatic for him. Michael is prepared to relocate back to the States and provide what they're calling a more stable family environment. He hasn't seen Noah in over a year." "I know, and I told him that. But Daniel, legally speaking, he has standing to contest the change. And given his financial situation, his education, his lack of any history with homelessness or mental health struggles." Eleanor didn't need to finish the sentence. Daniel understood the implication perfectly. Michael Morrison was everything the court system preferred, in a guardian, financially stable, conventionally successful, unburdened by the kind of dramatic personal history that raised questions about judgment and reliability. "Mrs. Morrison, I know this puts you in a difficult position." "No, Daniel, it doesn't. George and I have made our decision. We believe Noah belongs with his father, not with an uncle he barely knows, who's only now showing interest because his parents pressured him to get involved." Eleanor's voice was firm, resolute. "But I wanted you to know what you're facing, so you can prepare accordingly." After Eleanor hung up, Daniel stood in the quiet office feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, just when he'd started to believe that his life was finally heading in the right direction, another obstacle had appeared to block his path. "What is it?" Vivian asked, reading the devastation in his expression. Daniel explained about Michael Morrison, about the challenge to the custody change, about the possibility that all of his progress might not be enough to overcome the perception that Noah would be safer with anyone other than his father. "This is exactly what Catherine warned me about," he said, slumping into his chair. "The court system is designed to be risk-averse. When they have to choose between a homeless man who's gotten his life together and a successful professional with no baggage, which do you think they're going to pick? The one who loves Noah more. The one who's actually been trying to rebuild his relationship with his son." Vivian's voice carried a fierce certainty that Daniel wished he could share. "Michael Morrison may look good on paper, but he's a stranger to Noah. That has to count for something." "Does it? Or am I just telling myself that because I can't bear the alternative?" Vivian moved around the desk to where Daniel was sitting, and before he could object, she placed her hands on his shoulders, grounding him with her presence. "Listen to me. You are not the same man who lost custody 14 months ago. You're not even the same man who gave me his jacket at that bus stop. You've built something real here, something that can't be taken away by one person's legal maneuvering. But what if it's not enough? Or what if the judge looks at Michael's resume and my history and decides that stability trumps love? Then we'll appeal. We'll fight it every step of the way. But Daniel, you cannot give up before the battle is even fought. Too many people are counting on you, Noah, most of all. Daniel looked up at her. This woman, who had somehow become the center of his rebuilt world, and felt some of the panic begin to recede. She was right about one thing: he wasn't the same person he'd been a year ago. He'd learned to fight for what mattered, learned that sometimes the only way through difficulty was straight ahead. You're right. I'm not giving up. Not on Noah, not on any of this. He stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. I need to call Catherine, let her know what we're dealing with. And I need to talk to Noah, make sure he understands what's happening. What about us, what we were talking about before the call? Daniel paused, looking at Vivian with a mixture of longing and regret. The timing was impossible, the complications too significant to ignore. But the feelings were real, and he couldn't pretend otherwise. I care about you, Vivian. More than I should, probably more than is wise. But right now I have to focus on getting my son back. Everything else has to wait. I understand. And I'll be here when you're ready. The promise in her words was both comforting and terrifying, another variable in an equation that was already impossibly complex. The next morning, Daniel met with Catherine Morrison in her office, the urgency of Michael Morrison's challenge requiring immediate strategic adjustments to their case. This is unfortunate but not insurmountable, Catherine said, reviewing the new information with the dispassionate analysis of someone accustomed to legal complications. Michael Morrison's lack of relationship with Noah actually works in our favor, but we need to be prepared for him to argue that blood relationship trumps emotional connection. What's our best argument? Continuity of care. You've been the consistent presence in Noah's life, the parent he's been asking to come home. Michael Morrison is essentially a stranger who's decided to insert himself into the situation for reasons that have more to do with family pressure than genuine concern for Noah's welfare. Catherine walked Daniel through the revised strategy, the additional evidence they would need to present the character witnesses who could testify to his relationship with Noah and his transformation over the past months. There's one more thing, she said, as they wrapped up the meeting. I need to ask about your relationship with Vivian Langston. Daniel felt his stomach clench. What about it? Is it strictly professional, or is there a personal component that opposing counsel might try to exploit? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Daniel thought about the conversation in his office the night before, about the admission of feelings that couldn't be taken back, about the complicated territory they were navigating between professional and personal connection. It's professional, he said finally. She's my employer, and she's been supportive of my efforts to rebuild my life. But there's nothing inappropriate about our relationship. Catherine studied his face with the keen assessment of someone trained to detect deception. Good. Because any perception that you're romantically involved with your wealthy employer could be used to suggest that your stability is dependent on maintaining that relationship rather than your own capabilities. I understand. I hope you do. Because losing this custody case won't just mean another year of supervised visits with Noah. If Michael Morrison gets custody, it could mean the end of your parental rights entirely. The warning followed Daniel back to Langston Industries, where he threw himself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his own anxiety. The Henderson Industries training program was scheduled to begin the following week, and Daniel spent the day finalizing materials and rehearsing presentations, grateful for the distraction of professional responsibility. But his mind kept circling back to the custody hearing, to the possibility that everything he'd built might not be enough to overcome the court's preference for conventional stability over messy, emotional truth. That evening, Daniel drove out to Westchester for dinner with Noah and the Morrisons, a weekly tradition that had developed over the past month. The drive gave him time to prepare for one of the most difficult conversations he'd ever had with his son. Noah met him at the door with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about a school project on the solar system that had consumed his attention for the past week. They spent an hour working on a papier-mâché model of Saturn Noah's small hands, carefully applying strips of newspaper while he explained everything he'd learned about the planet's rings. "Daddy, did you know that Saturn would float if you put it in a bathtub big enough?" Noah asked, his face serious with the weight of newly acquired knowledge. "I did not know that. That's amazing, buddy." "Yeah, but you'd need a really, really big bathtub, like bigger than the whole world." Daniel smiled, marveling at his son's ability to find wonder in scientific facts, to imagine impossibly large bathtubs with the casual confidence of childhood. "Noah, can we talk about something important?" His son looked up from the Saturn model, immediately sensing the shift in tone. "Are you okay, Daddy?" "I'm fine. But I need to tell you about something that's happening with the grown-up stuff about you coming to live with me." Daniel explained as simply as he could about Uncle Michael's involvement, about the possibility that the judge might need more time to make a decision, about the fact that sometimes, even when adults tried their best, things didn't happen as quickly as everyone hoped. "Uncle Michael wants me to live with him." Noah's voice was small, confused. "He thinks it might be better for you. But what's most important to me is what you want. How you feel about everything." Noah was quiet for a long moment, his 7-year-old mind wrestling with concepts that were challenging even for adults to navigate. "I want to live with you, Daddy. I want to come home." The simple declaration hit Daniel like a physical blow, love and determination and heartbreak all tangled together in his chest. "I want that too, buddy, more than anything. And I'm going to keep fighting for it no matter what happens at the hearing. Promise? I promise." That night, after Noah had gone to bed, and Daniel had spent another hour discussing strategy with the Morrisons, he drove back to Manhattan, feeling the weight of his son's trust like a sacred obligation. Noah was counting on him to bring their family back together, and Daniel would move heaven and earth before he let that little boy down again. The week leading up to the custody hearing passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. The Henderson Industries training program launched successfully, with Daniel conducting workshops for over 200 middle managers across 3 days. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with participants reporting immediate improvements in their relationships with direct reports, and a new understanding of how empathetic leadership could improve business outcomes. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished," Vivian told him after the final Henderson session. Robert Henderson himself called to say he's never seen his managers so engaged with training material. They were having coffee in Daniel's office, maintaining the careful, professional distance they'd established since acknowledging their feelings for each other. But the undercurrent of attraction remained complicated by the approaching custody hearing and all the ways their personal relationship could jeopardize everything Daniel had worked to rebuild. "It feels good to be successful at something again," Daniel admitted. "To know that I'm actually helping people instead of just surviving day to day." "You're doing more than helping people. You're changing how entire organizations think about human relationships. That's not a small thing." Daniel looked at her across the small table, this woman who had seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself, who had risked her company's reputation and resources to give him a chance at redemption. "Whatever happens on Friday," he said quietly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for the job, but for believing in me when nobody else would." "Daniel, let me finish. I know things are complicated between us. I know the timing is terrible and the circumstances are messy, and there are a dozen reasons why we should keep things professional. But I also know that meeting you changed my life in ways that go far beyond employment and career opportunities." Vivian was quiet, her dark eyes reflecting emotions too complex to name. "I know," she said finally. "And when this is over, when Noah is home where he belongs, we'll figure out what comes next. Together." The promise in her words carried Daniel through the remaining days before the hearing, a reminder that regardless of what the court decided, he wasn't alone in facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of February day that made New York feel crisp with possibility. Daniel dressed carefully in his best suit, a purchase made possible by his Langston Industries salary, and met Catherine Morrison at the courthouse steps at 8:30 a.m. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, studying his appearance with the critical eye of someone who understood that first impressions could determine case outcomes. "As ready as I can be." "Good. Remember, we're not arguing that you're perfect or that your past mistakes don't matter. We're arguing that you've learned from those mistakes, that you've demonstrated the ability to change and grow, and that Noah belongs with his father rather than with a relative he barely knows." The courtroom was smaller than Daniel had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly pale. Eleanor and George Morrison sat in the gallery behind Daniel's table, their presence a visible show of support that he hoped the judge would notice. Vivian was there too, despite Catherine's advice that her attendance might raise questions about the nature of their relationship. Michael Morrison sat at the opposing table with his lawyer, a polished man in his early 30s, who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for successful young professionals. He was handsome in the conventional way that suggested good breeding and expensive education, the kind of person who had never had to choose between heating and eating, who had never slept in a truck, or wondered where his next meal was coming from. When Noah entered with the court-appointed advocate, Daniel's heart clenched at the sight of his son's serious expression. Noah looked small and vulnerable in his best clothes, clearly overwhelmed by the formal setting and the weight of adult decisions being made about his future. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Noah smiled a tentative, hopeful expression that reminded Daniel of everything he was fighting for. Judge Rebecca Martinez was a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the case files while the courtroom settled into expectant silence, then looked up to address the assembled parties. "This is a petition to modify an existing custody order," she began. "Mr. Daniel Hayes is seeking primary custody of his son Noah, currently in the care of his maternal grandparents. Mr. Michael Morrison has filed an intervention seeking custody himself. The question before this court is what arrangement would be in the best interests of the child." What followed was 3 hours of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal argument that would determine the course of Daniel's life and Noah's future. Daniel testified about his job, his apartment, his relationship with his son, and his commitment to providing stable, loving care. He answered questions about his period of homelessness with honesty and without apology, explaining how that experience had taught him lessons about resilience and compassion that made him a better father. Michael Morrison testified about his financial stability, his intention to relocate back to New York, and his belief that Noah would benefit from being raised by someone without Daniel's history of poor judgment and instability. His lawyer painted a picture of a successful professional who could provide Noah with opportunities and advantages that Daniel could never match. But it was Eleanor Morrison's testimony that proved most compelling. She spoke about watching Daniel rebuild his life, about his consistent efforts to maintain a relationship with Noah, about the joy on her grandson's face every time his father came to visit. "Michael is a good man," she said, "but he's been absent from Noah's life since his sister died. Daniel, despite his struggles, has never stopped fighting to be Noah's father. That has to count for something." When Noah was called to speak with the judge privately, Daniel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Everything came down to this: his 7-year-old son's ability to articulate what he wanted for his future. The private conference lasted 20 minutes, during which Daniel tried to read Judge Martinez's expressions for clues about how Noah's testimony was being received. When they returned to the courtroom, Noah looked directly at Daniel and smiled an expression of confidence that gave Daniel the first real hope he'd felt all day. "This court has heard testimony from all interested parties," Judge Martinez said as the hearing concluded. "I will take the matter under advisement and issue a written decision within 10 business days. Court is adjourned." As people filed out of the courtroom, Daniel found himself surrounded by his support network, Catherine offering cautious optimism, the Morrisons providing reassurance, Vivian squeezing his hand in a gesture of solidarity that conveyed everything words couldn't express. "Now we wait," Catherine said. "But Daniel, I want you to know that you presented yourself beautifully in there. Regardless of the outcome, you should be proud of how far you've come." The waiting period stretched ahead like an eternity, 10 business days, during which Daniel would have to continue functioning normally while his entire future hung in the balance. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, conducting training sessions and developing new program materials with the focused energy of someone trying to outrun his own anxiety. But in quiet moments during his morning coffee on the subway, ride home in the minutes before sleep, Daniel found himself replaying moments from the hearing, wondering if he'd said the right things, if Noah had been able to communicate his preferences clearly, if the judge had seen past his history to the man he'd become. The decision would come when it came. Until then, all he could do was continue building the life he hoped to share with his son one day at a time, with the knowledge that he'd given everything he had to the fight for their family's future. And no matter what happened, that would have to be enough. The 10 days of waiting stretched like months each morning, bringing Daniel awake with the immediate weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. He found himself checking his phone obsessively, despite Catherine's warning that the court decision would come via official mail, not through any electronic communication. Work became both salvation and torture. The Henderson Industries program was exceeding all expectations, with employee satisfaction scores rising dramatically across all measured metrics, but every success felt hollow when weighed against the possibility of losing Noah forever. On the 8th day, Daniel was conducting a workshop for senior executives at a pharmaceutical company when his phone buzzed with a call from Catherine Morrison. He excused himself from the conference room, his heart hammering as he answered in the hallway. "Daniel, you need to come to my office immediately. The decision came in. And just come now." The 30-minute taxi ride to Catherine's law office was the longest half-hour of Daniel's life. He stared out the window at the city rushing past, trying to read meaning into Catherine's tone, her refusal to give him any indication over the phone. Every traffic light felt like an eternity, every delayed turn a cruel extension of his agony. Catherine was waiting in her reception area when he arrived, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes carrying something that might have been hope. "Sit down, Daniel. Just tell me, please." She opened the official envelope from the court, her eyes scanning the document quickly before looking up at him. "The court grants your petition for modification of custody. Primary physical custody of Noah Morrison Hayes is awarded to his father, Daniel Hayes, effective immediately." The words hit Daniel like a physical force, relief and joy and disbelief crashing over him in waves. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but absorb the magnitude of what he'd just heard. "I get him back," he whispered. "You get him back." Judge Martinez was very clear in her reasoning. She noted your demonstrated stability, your consistent efforts to maintain a relationship with Noah, and most importantly, Noah's own expressed preference to live with his father. Catherine smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her. She also noted that Michael Morrison's sudden interest in custody after more than a year of absence suggested motivations that weren't necessarily in Noah's best interest. Daniel felt tears threatening the kind of overwhelming emotion that comes when hope transforms into reality after months of careful, cautious dreaming. "When can I pick him up?" "The Morrisons are expecting your call. From what I understand, Noah's bags are already packed." The drive to Westchester felt surreal, as if Daniel was moving through a dream that might dissolve if he acknowledged it too directly. He'd called Eleanor from Catherine's office, and her voice had carried joy and relief in equal measure. "He's been ready since the hearing," she'd said. "Every day asking if today was the day his daddy was coming to bring him home." Now pulling into the Morrison driveway for what would be the last time, as a visiting father, Daniel felt the weight of transformation settle around him like a new skin. 18 months ago, he'd been a broken man sleeping in a truck, wondering if he'd ever see his son again. Today, he was coming to collect Noah and bring him home to the life they would build together. Noah burst through the front door before Daniel could even get out of the car, his small body launching into his father's arms with the kind of unbridled joy that exists only in the hearts of children. Daddy, I knew you'd win. I told Grandma you'd win because you promised, and you never break promises." Daniel held his son tight, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of him real and present, and finally coming home. "That's right, buddy. No more visits. No more saying goodbye. You're coming home with me today and every day after that." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down her cheeks despite her smile. "He's been packed since Tuesday. 3 times. He kept adding things he thought he'd need for his new life with you." The goodbye was surprisingly emotional, with Eleanor and George both hugging Noah tightly and promising to see him soon whenever he wanted. There was relief in their faces too, the recognition that as much as they loved their grandson, raising him at their age had been a challenge they'd taken on out of necessity rather than desire. "Take care of him," Eleanor whispered to Daniel as they loaded Noah's belongings into his car. "Always. And Daniel, Sarah would be so proud of who you've become." The drive back to Manhattan was filled with Noah's chatter about his new school, his new room, all the things they would do together now that they were a real family again. Daniel found himself stealing glances in the rearview mirror, hardly believing that his son was really there, really coming home with him. "Daddy, will Ms. Vivian come to dinner sometimes? I want to meet the lady who helped you get better." The innocent question made Daniel's heart skip. Noah had heard enough fragments of adult conversations to understand that Vivian Langston had played an important role in his father's recovery, but he didn't know the full complexity of their relationship. "Maybe, buddy. We'll see." Their apartment, their home now, was modest but warm, a 1-bedroom that Daniel had carefully prepared for Noah's arrival. He'd given Noah the bedroom and set up a fold-out couch for himself in the living room, at least until they could find a larger place. Noah explored every corner with the wonder of a child discovering a new world, pronouncing each room perfect and the best ever. That evening, as they shared takeout Chinese food on the floor of their living room, and Noah had insisted it would be more fun than sitting at the table, Daniel felt peace settle over him for the first time in months. This was what he'd been fighting for, this simple moment of father and son together. No court supervision, no scheduled visits, just family dinner on a Tuesday night. "Daddy, are you happy now?" Noah asked, using chopsticks to chase lo mein noodles around his container. "The happiest I've ever been, buddy." "Are you happy?" "Yeah. But I think you should call Ms. Vivian and tell her the good news. She was worried about you." The suggestion was innocent enough, but it reminded Daniel of everything he'd put on hold during the custody battle. All the feelings and possibilities that had been carefully shelved until this moment could arrive. After Noah was asleep in his new room, surrounded by familiar toys and books that had made the journey from the Morrisons' house, Daniel found himself staring at his phone, Vivian's contact information on the screen. It was nearly 10 p.m., but he knew she'd want to hear the news immediately. She answered on the first ring. "Daniel, what did you find out?" "I got him back, Vivian. Full custody. Noah's home." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. "Vivian, I'm here. I'm so happy for you, Daniel. So incredibly happy." Her voice was thick with emotion, and Daniel could picture her in her apartment, probably sitting by those floor-to-ceiling windows, maybe wiping tears from her eyes. "How's Noah adjusting? Like he never left? He's already planning our weekend activities and asking when you can come meet him properly. He wants to meet me. He knows you're important to me. To us. He wants to thank the lady who helped his daddy get better." Another pause, this one charged with everything they hadn't said to each other, all the feelings that had been carefully contained while the custody battle played out. "Daniel, now that Noah's home, now that you've got your life back, can we talk tomorrow? In person, there are things I need to say to you, things that couldn't wait until everything was settled." "Yes, of course. Should I come to your apartment?" Daniel thought about Noah's eager questions about Ms. Vivian, about his son's curiosity regarding the woman who had played such a crucial role in their family's reunion. "Actually, would you like to have dinner with us? Nothing fancy, just the three of us. I think it's time you two met properly." "I'd love that. More than you know." The next evening, Daniel found himself more nervous than he'd been before the custody hearing. He'd spent the day explaining to Noah about Mrs. Vivian's visit, trying to convey the importance of the occasion without overwhelming his 7-year-old son with adult complexities. "Is she going to be my new mommy?" Noah had asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "We're friends, buddy. Very good friends. But let's just focus on getting to know each other first, okay?" Vivian arrived at exactly 6 p.m. carrying flowers for their makeshift dinner table and a wrapped gift that had Noah practically bouncing with excitement. She looked different outside the office environment, softer somehow, wearing jeans and a sweater that made her seem more approachable, more human. "You must be Noah," she said, kneeling down to his level. "Your daddy has told me so much about you." "Are you really rich?" Noah asked, causing Daniel to nearly choke on his coffee. Vivian laughed, a genuine sound that filled their small apartment with warmth. "I do okay. But you know what? The richest I've ever felt was the night your daddy gave me his jacket when I was cold and needed help." Noah studied her with the serious attention children give to adults they're trying to figure out. "He's really good at helping people. That's what daddies do." "You're absolutely right. That's exactly what good daddies do." Dinner was a revelation. Vivian, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals with ruthless efficiency, was completely charmed by Noah's 7-year-old observations about everything from dinosaurs to space travel to why vegetables were probably good for you but still kind of yucky. She listened to his stories with the same focused attention she gave to business presentations, asking follow-up questions and laughing at his jokes with genuine delight. "You know what I think?" Noah announced as they were clearing dishes. "I think Ms. Vivian should come to dinner every night." "Every night might be too much, buddy," Daniel said, shooting Vivian a look of amused apology. "How about we start with once a week and see how it goes?" Vivian suggested diplomatically. After Noah was in bed, Daniel and Vivian found themselves alone in his living room, the weight of unspoken conversation settling between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "He's amazing," Vivian said softly. "So smart and funny and kind. I can see why you fought so hard to get him back. He likes you. That's not something that happens easily. Noah's pretty selective about the adults he trusts. I'm honored by his approval. Vivian moved closer to Daniel on the small couch, close enough that he could catch the scent of her perfume, close enough to see the vulnerability in her dark eyes. Daniel, these past months working with you, watching you transform your life. I know. I've felt it too. From that first night at the bus stop, there's been something between us that I couldn't name, couldn't acknowledge, while everything else was so uncertain. And now, with Noah home, with your life stable, what happens now? Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with the careful attention of someone handling something precious. Now I tell you that I love you. That somewhere between that night when you were shivering at a bus stop and tonight when you charmed my son over takeout pizza, you became essential to my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. Vivian's breath caught her eyes, filling with tears that she didn't try to hide. I love you too. I've loved you since the moment you gave me your jacket, without expecting anything in return. But Daniel, I need you to know, I don't want to be another person you feel grateful to, another benefactor you think you owe. Is that what you think, that this is gratitude? I don't know what to think. Our entire relationship started with me helping you, giving you opportunities, solving your problems. How do I know your feelings are real and not just... Daniel silenced her with a kiss, gentle but certain, pouring everything he couldn't articulate into the connection between them. When they broke apart, both were breathing heavily, the air between them charged with possibility. Let me tell you what I know, he said quietly. I know that the night I gave you my jacket, I wasn't thinking about getting anything in return. I saw someone who needed help, and I helped because that's who I am at my core. You didn't fall in love with someone who was looking for a reward. You fell in love with someone who acts with kindness even when it costs him. But everything that followed happened because you recognized something in me that I'd forgotten existed. You didn't create the man you love, Vivian. You just reminded him how to be himself again. She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for certainty in his eyes. I'm scared, she admitted. I've never felt this way about anyone. I've never wanted to build a life with someone, never imagined myself as part of a family. What if I'm not good at it? What if I disappoint Noah or you, or what if you don't? What if instead of focusing on all the ways things could go wrong, we focus on all the ways they could go right? Daniel pulled her closer until she was tucked against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. I have a 7-year-old son who thinks you're wonderful. I have a job I love that exists because you believed in me. I have an apartment that feels like home for the first time in 2 years. But none of that matters compared to this, to you, to us, to the possibility of building something together that's bigger than either of us alone. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to try. I want to see where this leads, what we can create together. Not because I owe you anything, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Vivian lifted her head to look at him, and Daniel saw his own hopes reflected in her expression. Noah comes first, she said finally. Always. Whatever happens between us, his well-being has to be the priority. Agreed. But Vivian, I think Noah's going to love having you in his life. Tonight was just the beginning. They talked until nearly midnight, planning and dreaming, and acknowledging the challenges that lay ahead. Blending their lives wouldn't be simple, Vivian's demanding career. Noah's need for stability, the complexity of building a relationship that had started in crisis and was now transitioning to something resembling normal adult romance. But as Daniel watched Vivian carefully fold the blanket she'd been using as he saw her pause to straighten one of Noah's drawings that had been taped to the refrigerator. He felt certainty settle around him like armor. This woman who commanded corporate boardrooms was also someone who noticed a child's artwork and cared enough to make sure it was properly displayed. This was someone who could be part of their family. 3 months later, on a warm May evening, Daniel stood in the community center, where he'd first begun to believe in second chances, watching Vivian address a room full of business executives about the power of empathy in leadership. The program they'd built together had expanded beyond anything they'd originally imagined, with companies across the country implementing similar initiatives and reporting transformative results. Noah sat beside Daniel in the back of the room, listening with the serious attention he gave to anything involving his father's work. At 8 years old, he was still too young to fully understand corporate consulting, but he grasped the essential message that treating people with kindness made everything better. "Daddy," Noah whispered, "Ms. Vivian is really good at this." "She is, buddy. She's good at a lot of things." "Are you going to marry her?" The question asked with Noah's characteristic directness made Daniel's heart skip. It wasn't the first time his son had brought up the possibility, but tonight, watching Vivian command the room with intelligence and compassion, the idea felt less like speculation and more like inevitability. "Would you like that?" "Yeah, I think she makes you happy, and she makes really good pancakes." Daniel laughed softly, marveling at his son's ability to reduce complex adult relationships to their most essential elements. Vivian did make him happy. She also made excellent pancakes, helped with homework, and had somehow convinced Noah that vegetables could be an adventure for your taste buds instead of a nightly battle. As Vivian concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, Daniel felt the pieces of his life settling into a pattern that finally made sense. He had his son back, he had work that mattered, and he had a woman who loved them both with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd found her own family after thinking she didn't want one. Later that evening, after Noah was asleep and Vivian was grading the boys' latest spelling test at their kitchen table, she'd somehow become an integral part of their nightly routine. Daniel found himself thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought them all together. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "At the bus stop, every day," she said, without looking up from Noah's careful penmanship. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the bus had come on time, if I hadn't been stranded there. We would have found each other somehow. I'm sure of it." "How can you be sure?" Daniel reached over and turned her face toward his, seeing his own certainty reflected in her dark eyes. "Because some connections are inevitable. Because the universe has a way of putting people in each other's paths when they're ready to find what they're looking for." "And what were you looking for that night?" "I thought I was just looking for a way to stay warm. Turns out I was looking for a way home." Vivian smiled, the expression that had become as familiar to Daniel as breathing, and leaned over to kiss him with the easy affection of someone who'd found her place in the world. Outside their apartment window, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their own dreams of connection and purpose. Somewhere out there, other strangers were making choices that would define their futures. Other acts of kindness were creating ripples that would spread far beyond their immediate impact. But inside their small apartment, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were building something that felt like forever. One pancake breakfast, one bedtime story, one moment of ordinary magic at a time. And it all started with a jacket freely given on the coldest night of the year, proof that sometimes the smallest gesture of kindness can rewrite the entire story of a life. The following winter, exactly 2 years after that first night at the bus stop, Vivian stood in the same location, but this time she wasn't shivering and stranded. She was waiting, wrapped in the same brown canvas jacket that had started everything watching Daniel approach, with Noah skipping beside him through the December snow. "Are you sure this is where you want to do this?" Daniel asked, his breath visible in small puffs of vapor. "I'm sure. This is where it all began." Noah, now 9 and wise beyond his years, had been let in on the secret weeks earlier. He bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement as Daniel knelt down in the snow at the exact spot where he'd first seen Vivian 2 years before. "Vivian Langston," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Will you marry us?" The question, deliberately phrased to include Noah in the proposal, brought tears to Vivian's eyes as she looked at this man and boy who'd become her whole world. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry both of you." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, and Noah cheered loudly enough to startle passing pedestrians, Vivian realized that the woman who'd sat shivering at this bus stop 2 years ago had been waiting her entire life for this moment without knowing it. She'd thought she was successful, complete, satisfied with the life she'd built through determination and ruthless focus on professional achievement. But she'd been wrong. She hadn't been living at all, just surviving in the most comfortable way possible, insulated from real connection by wealth and status, and the belief that needing other people was a weakness she couldn't afford. Daniel and Noah had taught her that the opposite was true, that allowing yourself to love and be loved, to become part of something bigger than your individual ambitions, wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that gave life meaning. 6 months later, they were married in that same community center, where Daniel had first begun to understand his value as a teacher and healer, surrounded by employees from Langston Industries, the Morrison grandparents, former colleagues who'd become friends, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Noah served as ring-bearer with the solemnity of someone who understood he was witnessing the official creation of his family. As Daniel and Vivian exchanged vows, they'd written themselves promises about choosing kindness, about seeing each other clearly, about building a life based on love rather than fear. Their son stood beside them as both witness and participant in the commitment they were making. The reception was exactly what Daniel and Vivian had wanted, not elegant or expensive, but warm and genuine, filled with laughter and stories, and the kind of joy that comes when people who truly care about each other have reason to celebrate. Marcus Webb gave a speech about watching 2 workaholics discover that the most important work they'd ever do was learning to be a family. Eleanor Morrison, tears streaming down her cheeks, toasted the father Noah always deserved and the woman who helped him remember how to be that man. But it was Noah himself who brought down the house when he stood up during the toasts, his small voice clear and confident as he addressed the room full of adults. "I just want to say that my daddy taught me that being brave means helping people, even when you don't have to. And Ms. Vivian, he corrected himself with a grin. She taught me that families can start in lots of different ways, but they all work the same if everybody loves each other." As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out into the warm June night, Daniel found himself standing with his new wife and his son, looking at the photographs that chronicled their unlikely journey. There was the picture of him giving his last workshop as a single father, Vivian watching from the back of the room with undisguised pride. There was Noah's first day at his new school, flanked by both adults who were learning to co-parent with more grace than any of them had expected. There were dozens of small moments that had seemed ordinary when they were happening, but now looked like stepping stones toward this inevitable destination. "What happens now?" Vivian asked, echoing the question she'd posed that first night in his apartment, when everything was still uncertain. "Now we go home," Daniel said simply. "All 3 of us together. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we get up and do it again. And the day after that, and the day after that, until ordinary becomes extraordinary, just because we're doing it together. Noah, who'd been unusually philosophical all evening, looked up at his father and stepmother with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about the things that matter most. "I think," he said solemnly, "that this is the best story ever, better than any book." As they walked out of the community center into the warm summer evening, Daniel carrying his sleepy son, and Vivian's hand firmly clasped in his, he realized Noah was absolutely right. It was the best story ever, not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was theirs. And like all the best stories, it had started with a single act of kindness between strangers, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple decision to see another person's need and choose to help even when you have nothing left to give. The jacket that had started it all now hung framed in their living room, not as a relic of hardship overcome, but as a reminder that the smallest choices can reshape entire lives. Every morning as Daniel made coffee and Vivian packed Noah's lunch and their son complained about having to wear matching socks, they walked past that jacket and remembered that love stories don't always begin with lightning bolts and orchestral swells. Sometimes they begin with a stranger shivering at a bus stop, and another stranger who decides that her warmth matters more than his own comfort. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations start with the most ordinary kindness. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, the person you help on the worst night of your life turns out to be exactly the person you were meant to find all along.